Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty is one of those games. It's a game that changes things for you. It's a game with purpose, with intent, not only in its message, but in its character, its gameplay, and its design. It fits all of the cliches of a numbered sequel, doing everything just a bit better than the first entry did. And sure, there's some bumps in the road, but MGS2 makes its own path. It carves out its own unique spot in the history of the Metal Gear series. That's hard to do for a game with the number 2 at the end of its title, because it falls somewhere in the middle. It isn't the first, and it wasn't the last, so it becomes hard to make its own mark. But boy, does MGS2 make its mark. Some specific scenes have gone down in history as prophetic or terrifyingly realistic, and while the game does have a finale that can be a bit shocking, it also manages to recontextualize the entire story right before the finish line. It's fun to play, it has a lasting effect, it made its own legacy. What more could you want from an MGS game? This is what I'll be talking about today. I'm going to dive deep into MGS2, talking about gameplay, mechanics, story, and everything in between. If you haven't seen my previous video on Metal Gear Solid and the previous games in the series, I would highly recommend going to check that out first. This video makes a point of comparing this entry to a few of the previous ones. It isn't 100% required, but this video will make a lot more sense with context. If you do enjoy the video, don't forget to like it and subscribe, as it really helps out the channel. As a good rule of thumb, if I start talking about a game, just assume I'm going to spoil it. Hey Dad, it's me, your favorite son, and today I'd like to talk about Metal Gear Solid 2. The first game that we actually need to talk about, though, is technically not even canon to the Metal Gear Solid storyline. It's not directed by Hideo Kojima, and it was on a mobile platform. But don't let any of that dissuade you, because Ghost Babel is a heavily overlooked entry in the series. While Kojima didn't direct Ghost Babel, he was involved as the producer of the game. Ghost Babel was developed for the Game Boy Color as a sort of version of MGS that people could play on the go. The idea originated when Konami was made aware of the European popularity of Metal Gear Solid. The release of that PS1 title had caused a lot of buzz, and fans were clamoring for a way to play MGS with a handheld console. Shinta Nojiri would head the game's direction. He worked on Police Knots originally, but this time around he was given a much larger role. Because of this task, though, he would join the MGS2 team a bit late. He was heavily focused on creating an effective way to bring the same systems and style that the Metal Gear franchise had become known for to a handheld system. This created some issues, though, as the team also had to deal with the fact that players would only be interacting with the game in mostly short bursts, on the train, during breaks, etc. This was solved by breaking the game up into stages rather than one cohesive narrative. Ikuya Nakamura was in charge of the pixel and screen design for the game. He had already worked on Metal Gear Solid in character modeling and as a texture artist. He was also incredibly focused on keeping the same style as MGS, but with the Game Boy Color. They only had so much power to work with. This meant that every pixel had to be placed with care. One small change would create a different tone for an environment or a different emotion for a character. Tomokazu Fukushima wrote Ghost Babel. If you remember from the first video I did on MGS, Fukushima worked with Kojima on that game, providing a lot of dialogue for the optional codec calls. But just because Kojima wasn't directing Ghost Babel doesn't mean that he wasn't involved. He's credited with the original planning of the game and the story. He was responsible for a lot of the heavier elements that the game introduces, and it sure does have those in spades. At the time, the PS2 was about to hit the market, and fidelity in video games was about to take another jump forward. Because of that, Kojima thought it would be fun to develop for a system that was kind of in the opposite direction, to take a bit of a step backwards rather than forwards. He also was really focused on having people ask themselves one question while playing Ghost Babel: what is a game? I'll be happy if many people after playing this game will ask themselves, what is a game? I won't go incredibly deep on Ghost Babel because it technically is non-canon, but it is a pretty big bridge in the development of MGS1 and MGS2. The game itself was technically released in the US as Metal Gear Solid on the Game Boy Color. This was a marketing tactic to get people to purchase the game, believing it to be a straight mobile remake of the PS1 title, but this isn't really true. The reason that Ghost Babel technically isn't canon is because it's set in an alternate world where Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake never happened. In this timeline, Snake has been living in Alaska for 3 years. He quit Foxhound and retired, but of course, Campbell needs him for another job. A transport plane was carrying a Metal Gear to South America, but it was intercepted by terrorists. Apparently, the US government had taken the data from the Metal Gear in Outer Heaven and used it to start producing new prototypes. South America was meant to be the site of the first field test for the new machine. The weapon was taken to a small country called Gindra, which currently has a civil war going on. The Gindra Liberation Front, or the GLF, are the ones responsible for the hijacking, led by a man named General Augustine Iguaban. The fortress where Metal Gear is being kept is called Galuad. Snake doesn't really want any part of this mission at first, but once Campbell reveals that the fortress is also being referred to as Outer Heaven, he's a little bit more interested. This version of Snake has turned out a bit differently than the Snake that we see in MGS and MGS2. He's more reserved, prefers the quiet life that he's found in Alaska, and doesn't really want to get involved in this conflict. If the past is at your heels, turn around and face it. Our goal, obviously, is to infiltrate the fortress, take out the Metal Gear, and rescue the hostages. The usual stuff. The Army's Delta Force has already breached the fortress, and our job is to assist them. We have 4 people backing us up on the codec here. Mei Ling, a PhD candidate at MIT who is our contact for saving the game. Brian McBride, Director of Operations at the CIA who planned the mission. If we call him, we get knowledge on Gindra, the mission, GLF, and the surrounding environments. The third member is Ronard Lensenbrink, codename Weasel, a mercenary who's mostly untrustworthy, but his skills match Snake's. If we call him, we can get info on the mercs that work for the GLF. Campbell is our 4th point of contact, and he was really only called in because he worked with Snake before. He apparently also has some personal business with the job as well. This is our whole team, and just as with the other entries in the series, we can generally call these people freely over the codec. They'll provide us valuable information or just context for the current situation. Snake eventually parachutes into Galuad in an opening scene that's quite reminiscent of the NES version of Metal Gear. In a lot of ways, the statements before about backwards progression are pretty true for this game. It plays quite a lot like the MSX Metal Gear 2. It's a very similar feeling, though there are quite a few differences in gameplay. We don't just follow the same path, taking care of the same obstacles. Ghost Babel manages to set itself apart in a lot of ways. General structure, objectives, and story all make it stand out from those original Metal Gear titles. But the general gist is mostly the same. We're sneaking around a fortress, looking to complete specific objectives that change with each stage. We have a silenced weapon, which will be our main method of attack. We can take enemies out from up close, sneak around in a cardboard box. The DNA of the series is still very much here. Though the style is a bit different and some of the pixel art is a little more subdued because of the system that it was on, it feels like another genuine attempt at a straightforward Metal Gear title. The biggest feature of Ghost Babel that was so impressive for the time was the multiplayer function. This could be set up by connecting two Game Boys with link cables. You could then battle your friends in one-on-one matches. This was absolutely insane for the time and was actually the first example of multiplayer that the series ever had. I couldn't actually play that versus mode for this review because I emulated this game and I don't have a Game Boy Color just laying around, but it was a pretty large feature to throw in the game, adding a whole mode for people to toy around with. That's sort of the general theme of Ghost Babel, is that there's just so much here that wasn't really necessary. This could have just been a small, easy throwaway port, but just as with the titles we've already talked about in the series, everyone on the team genuinely cared about the project and wanted to make it the best that it could be. At the start of the game, our goal is to head to the fortress, but things start to get pretty sticky when we're told that the Delta Force we're supposed to rendezvous with have been wiped out. One person has managed to survive, Kris Jenner, a woman who is now a part of our team on the inside. She gives us some pretty good information in the form of mostly bad news. Metal Gear is almost fully assembled, the leader of the mercs we're about to face is named Black Arts Viper, and that we're going to have to enter a drainage system to get inside. When we enter the system, we need to get inside Galuad and find Kris, who has disguised herself as an enemy soldier. I mean, we know the drill at this point. We've done this in MG2, we've done this in MGS, and we're about to do it again in Ghost Babel. Once we meet up with her, she tells us that the lead engineer on the Metal Gear team is named James Harks, or Jimmy the Wizard. He happens to be located in the barracks to the north of this building. At the same time, Kris gives us our introduction to the mercs, almost in the same way that Campbell does at the beginning of MGS. A full cast of characters on display here, our villains laid out before us in a clear path. Slasher Hawk, who uses a boomerang as his signature weapon, Marionette Owl, an expert assassin and master of nocturnal combat, Pyro Bison, who reminds me quite a lot of the cryptic nature of Vulcan Raven with the descriptor, practices his own scorched earth tactics with a massive flamethrower, and finally, their leader, Black Arts Viper. The group themselves are former US forces, and they appeared about 2 years ago. From here, we have to follow Kris through the facility to find our way out. She decides to head to the power plant, and we head to the barracks to find Jimmy. On the way, we meet the first of our villains in this entry, Slasher Hawk. We have to dodge his quick and long-range boomerang attacks. He even sends his hawk after us. After we defeat him, in true Metal Gear Solid fashion, he tells us about himself. In this way, Ghost Babel is very similar to MGS. Each villain we defeat gives us their final words, and in this way, we piece together the story, but we also gain empathy for the villains. But Ghost Babel sets itself apart by being a bit darker and a bit more emotional than MGS. And these are subtle differences, but it works to make the game feel like its own. Easily the most memorable part of this game for me was its characters. Slasher Hawk's story is that he grew up in Australia, living with the Aborigines. He was eventually abandoned by his parents, and his new adopted parents took him in. His entire life was just trying to fit in with people around him, trying hard to learn their customs and culture, but he was never accepted. This state of mind left fertile ground for him to be swept up by Viper. The man actually took him in and accepted him, something that he had never felt before, but had always wanted. Before Hawk dies, he tells Snake that Viper will get revenge for his death. His bird carries his spirit away, and he's gone. With Hawk out of our way, we find Jimmy in the barracks. He actually turns out to be a young kid, a genius prodigy of engineering. We have to blow the wall into his cell to get him out. With this, he gives us a lot more information on the new Metal Gear. The weapon has been assembled, which means that they are closer and closer to launching a nuke. Metal Gear was originally brought to South America to do nuclear tests. Parker, the chief of Army staff, is a big fan of the project, and so it didn't matter what happened, they got all the funding that was needed. There's also something behind Metal Gear as well, something called Project Babel, but Jimmy doesn't know what it is. Jimmy plays the role of Otacon here. He's the nerdy engineer that knows a lot about Metal Gear and helps us with it, but he definitely isn't the same character as Otacon. He's very vocal, annoying, and kind of bratty, but this is to be expected. He's a young kid that's somehow stumbled into developing incredibly powerful weapons for nations to use. Unlike Otacon, he knows about their use, but he doesn't really seem to care. He's far too young to understand the consequences of his actions. While Snake and Jimmy chat, the power is cut. We learn that the team is trying to draw power from the facility to start up Metal Gear, and this has caused a massive outage. We have to navigate the facility in the dark, and we leave Jimmy in the care of Chris. This leads to some particularly funny calls where Chris basically says that she hates taking care of him. This leads us into a massive level where we have to navigate these conveyors to get to different rooms. This takes the incredibly small idea from the first two Metal Gear games where we would get in a box and convince the guards that we were just a piece of cargo to get inside a building or move around, and wraps that idea into an entire level. We have to collect colored boxes to hide in, and switching to different colors will determine which paths the machines send us on. I really like this level because there's just so much hidden here, so many different areas to search. It does require a ton of experimenting and finding different paths, but it's really well done. At the end of this sequence, we come across our second boss battle, Marionette Owl. Owl has two dolls that support him, Kohal and Osan, figures that are endowed with spirits. This fight is done in the dark because Owl is a master of nocturnal combat, but we can use thermal goggles to offset this a bit. It doesn't really matter because we get blasted by flash grenades, so we just have to spray and pray for the most part. Once Owl is defeated, he tells us that when he was 12, his friend Laura was murdered by a serial killer. Finding her body eventually caused him to snap and become a killer himself. He got lost in the madness, but this once again created fertile soil for Viper to implant his ideals. He took Owl in and gave him a way to satiate his madness. Owl says that Black Chamber, the group that these mercs are a part of, were betrayed by Foxhound 2 years ago, something Snake knows nothing about. Viper lost his arm, and he's vowed revenge on them ever since. Metal Gear has now entered its launch phase. We try to head to the facility where it's being kept, but Viper blasts Snake back with helicopter and artillery fire. They've already launched a nuke. Apparently they targeted the US at a nuclear testing facility, so no casualties, but the US still needs a cover story. At this point, we intercept a transmission that was sent to the US from the General, the head of this whole resistance. He wants the US to withdraw their troops from Gindra, but the US doesn't plan on negotiating with terrorists. Our only option now is to destroy the power plant. If Snake can remove the power source from Metal Gear, it won't be able to function. At this point, Chris and Jimmy are captured, but we're forced to go after the power plant anyways because it's the more important objective. We have to target different structural beams throughout the power plant, destroying them with C4. Snake ends up having to escape the burning and exploding facility. Before we do all this though, we have to fight Pyro Bison, our third boss. There is a big change made to the character of Snake here that I just want to quickly point out. It's been pretty clear for the whole game that Snake doesn't want or really even like the name Legend. This game carries the idea that Snake has now become an idea that's bigger than himself. Because of his heroic actions, he's recognized as an icon, but he doesn't view it this way. He constantly makes points that push down that notoriety. He's almost ashamed of what he's done. This is no clearer than in the Pyro Bison fight, when the man affirms this feeling to Snake, referring to him not as a legend, but a sinner. This change is interesting, because Snake was never fond of his hero status, but in this entry, it almost feels like shame or regret, as if what he's actively doing is something that he can't face. His head is turned away from the action to separate himself from it. Bison is one of the more difficult fights in the game as he attacks us with all manner of flame shots, pillars of fire, pools of heat, etc. When we defeat him, he gives us a lot more background on Black Chamber. They were created out of the shadow of Foxhound. Since Foxhound had become legends in the wake of Outer Heaven, the government needed a group of mercenaries that were truly in the dark. They were doing the dirty work, so to speak. Bison once again chastises Snake, specifically referencing how many people Snake has killed in this specific game. He also drops the little golden nugget that one of the Black Chamber has already infiltrated their ranks. Bison then dies exactly the way that he wants to, engulfed in flame. Once the power plant is destroyed, so is the artillery, preventing us from heading north. The general then sends another message, ensuring the US that Metal Gear can still be launched without power to its railgun. They've already prepared for this. We end up finding Jimmy. He's facing a crisis of conscience. He was saved by a soldier who survived from Delta Force. He told Jimmy that Chris wasn't there when the team was ambushed, but Jimmy is starting to be faced with what he's done, and he hates himself for it. The fact that he's created a weapon that will kill a lot of people is too much burden to carry. Snake tries to bring him out of this, telling him that he can always start over, and it almost feels like Snake is talking to himself here. Unfortunately, this tender moment is cut short as Jimmy's handcuffs explode and he's killed. Viper did this on purpose, right in front of Snake. At this point, the team has fully begun to suspect that Chris is the traitor in their ranks. She hasn't answered her codec, and a woman is flying the next helicopter that we have to fight, and she looks quite similar to Chris. When we take the helicopter down, we realize it's actually a woman named Sophie Nadram, the second in command to the general. She was sort of born to be a rebel. She was born to a Gindran mother and a British father, but her dad left immediately and wanted nothing to do with her. Her mother ended up dying to government soldiers, so she joined the GLF. She went to school in Britain and brought back skills with her that could help her country. She sided with the general because she felt he was a future for her people. In the end, Snake spares her, and we can finally get to Metal Gear, what this has all been about. When we get inside the base, we're face to face with Black Viper. He has Chris captured. He decides to give us his cliche villain, explain everything before we fight speech. Black Chamber was sent in to recover a Metal Gear 2 years ago. They destroyed it, but pretty soon the government became worried about them. They didn't want Metal Gear's existence to go public, so they sent Foxhound in to take them out. An anonymous individual ordered the destruction of the group and the surviving members, most of which are dead at this point, vowed to get vengeance. We fight Viper in a field of lasers that we have to navigate, and when we win, he escapes. Chris admits that she was here to destroy evidence of Project Babel and to take out the general. She believed that she was doing good, but because of her honesty, Snake gives her a pass. When we head below, Metal Gear is revealed, and the general is piloting the weapon. We fight him twice, once while avoiding and trying to destroy its legs, and then dealing with its weapons one by one. After the fight, the general tells Snake that Outer Heaven was backed by the US. Big Boss had become a loose cannon, and they sent Snake in to deal with him. The US was also backing the GLF the whole time. They were trying to orchestrate events to create hostility between nations and alliances. With this climate of dissent, they were allowed to keep their forces there to force control. Project Babel was really about establishing the US as the only superpower in the world. The proof of all this deception is on a disc that the general gives to Snake. After this, Viper returns, revealing that actually he was behind everything, and the general was just a means to an end. Viper reveals that the colonel was in charge of Foxhound when they attacked Black Chamber, and once again Roy Campbell plays dumb. McBride, the CIA man, is the mole in our camp. But at the end of the day, it's a Metal Gear game, and there's really only one way that this can end. We fist fight Viper to finish things off. After he's defeated, Sophie decides to stay here to rebuild Gindra properly. Snake escapes with Chris, and McBride is taken down for being a mole. Weasel also reveals he's a mole, but that he likes the team too much to kill them, and Campbell wasn't really the bad guy because he was being blackmailed into taking out Black Chamber. The story ends with Snake heading off to return to the US. He wants answers, and he wants truth from the people that did this, and Chris will wait for him in the meantime. Obviously, we would never see that story because this was a one-off entry in the series, but Ghost Babel for the most part succeeds at what it set out to do. It's a very good mobile version of Metal Gear, one that appeals to the traveling man, the busy man, the man on the go. But it also manages to create an identity of its own, moving past just being a port of a larger title, and becoming its own entry in the series. I do think it suffers just slightly from some of the hiccups of being more lumped into the Metal Gear entries rather than Metal Gear Solid. It just felt like there was sort of a natural progression of increased technology for the series. And don't get me wrong, I love the idea of going back in a way, but it also leaves a little bit to be desired. The attention to detail is there though, and the team even created a little radio play that's hidden in the game's codec, only accessible during the second playthrough. Ghost Babel was a critical success and would go down as one of the best games released on the Game Boy Color. It certainly was a fun detour, a powerful what-if scenario. But like I said before, the PlayStation 2 was now on the horizon, and now that Metal Gear Solid had become a smash hit for players everywhere, they were begging for another entry in the series. With the arrival of the Sony PlayStation 2, games were once again lurching forward into a new generation. Fidelity was increased, processing power was at an all-time high. We could finally realize worlds, but not just worlds where we could do tiny little things, like get in boxes again and sneak around secret military facilities. The idea of a sequel to Metal Gear Solid was a no-brainer. The first game in this new official series was a giant success. It was one of the most successful games on the PlayStation, so it only made sense that Konami, Kojima, and the team go back for some more. And this time, just about everyone was back. Kojima returned as the director, obviously, making it a true Hideo Kojima game. Yoshikazu Matsuhana, who was the assistant director on the first game, returned in the same role. Motoyuki Yoshioka was returning as producer. Tomokazu Fukushima returned as assistant writer. Yoji Shinkawa was back to character design and art directing. Even Motosada Mori was back as the military advisor. They were even once again constructing environments with Legos to plan little things out. The gang was back and they were ready to go. There actually was an idea originally to create Metal Gear Solid 3 instead of MGS2. This was outlined in the Metal Gear Solid 2 Grand Game Plan document that Kojima created. And this document honestly gives us a ton of insight into the original ideas that were had for Metal Gear Solid 2. One of the biggest things that I took from this document was that the team wanted to introduce new ideas to the game without getting rid of the things that worked the first time around. We will try to implement a multi-layered content structure that entices both players who have played MGS1 and those who have not. However, we will not blatantly ignore the core players we acquired with MGS1 just to try to increase our player base and sales. This is incredibly refreshing, and I've talked about this before when looking at older video games. This design philosophy seems to be completely removed from the modern AAA gaming landscape, where now the idea seems to be to cast as wide of a net as possible to try and increase sales above all else, rather than maintaining the original fan base. And the document actually goes to great lengths to explain how the team would go about doing this, the difference in approach between appealing to new players and appealing to old ones. Large emphasis was also put on not shooting for realistic or cinematic visuals, but deliberately lowering the quality of the visuals and using the extra processing power to create mechanics that would impress instead. This was a way to set the game apart from what Kojima imagined other studios would be doing. With other teams chasing incredible realism, they could stick to solid graphics that would instill increased fidelity from the last generation, but also make new mechanics that made the world feel more real, feeling over fidelity. Reveals were done at E3, but the team really wanted to keep a lot of MGS2 hidden from the public because they had a lot of big reveals in plan for this entry in the series. In some ways, it was meant to be the same as MGS1, but also in every way, it was meant to be wildly different. Because of those big spoilers and reveals, I'd like to get into talking about the game a bit first before we talk about development. Just like with MGS and almost every other game in the series, there are a bunch of different versions of MGS2. The game itself was actually released on November 13th, 2001 in North America, 2 weeks before its release in Japan. This was actually pretty big for the series, and this was done because the game was such a large hit in America. In 2002, the game was then re-released with a version called Metal Gear Solid 2 Substance. I should note that the Substance name comes from the singles compilation album of the same name by Joy Division. Joy Division is one of Kojima's favorite bands. This version of the game added the VR missions, the Snake Tales side stories, and a skateboarding minigame, among a few other small changes to the main game. The Substance version was then re-released under the Metal Gear Solid HD collection on the PlayStation 3, and this is probably the easiest and best way to play the game in my opinion. This was also the way that I played the game for this review, though I did also emulate the original version of the game, and the Legacy Collection version was my preferred way to play it. Metal Gear Solid 2 begins with Snake's voiceover, narrating and setting the scene. 2 years ago, they found intel on where a new Metal Gear was being transported. We then see a man walking along a bridge in the rain. This scene is a long, drawn-out reveal that eventually shows us Snake jumping down onto a transport barge in the rain. It's excessive, it's dramatic, it's kind of moody, and it's exactly the return to Metal Gear that anyone would want. Kojima himself stated that this sequence was meant to be an intense reveal. It was meant to sort of toy with the fans and keep them wondering whether the man in the raincoat is really Snake or not. And it works in that respect. I mean, it's sort of difficult to remove yourself at this point and wonder whether it is Snake when you already know that it is, but it does just work as a great intro action sequence. It very much parallels a lot of action movies from the 80s and 90s, especially the sequels that reintroduced their characters. Bringing that familiar face back for a second time should bring people out of their seats. From here, we see Ocelot watching Snake through binoculars. Otacon calls Snake over the codec, and we get our first appearance of the famous
"Kept you waiting, huh?"
Unfortunately, Snake's stealth camo is busted, so this is just turned into a good old-fashioned stealth mission. Otacon will be our only codec assistant throughout this mission. Mei Ling is working for the Army SSCEN and was actually stealing equipment from them for Snake and Otacon, but Otacon told her to quit. Naomi also obviously isn't involved because she was arrested for treason. At this point, things have moved a lot since we saw Snake and Otacon in MGS. Ocelot ended up selling the technical specs of Metal Gear on the black market. This created a world where every state now has its own Metal Gear, a sort of cold war between all countries, leading them to need a weapon to protect themselves from other ones. If everyone has it, why don't we? The data on the new Metal Gear that Snake and Otacon are tracking is an amphibious anti-Metal Gear. It happens to be under the jurisdiction of the Marines. The mission here isn't to destroy the Metal Gear, but to get photographic evidence of its existence. Since Snake and Otacon have almost no information on this prototype, they need to figure out exactly what it's capable of and how close to completion it is. Snake and Otacon are also not working with the government anymore, which is why Campbell isn't here. They've created their own organization called Philanthropy. Though they're still on the fringe, they are recognized by the UN. This puts them in sort of a weird spot because they are technically legal, but not exactly. They're sort of a gray operation, somewhere in the in-between. Otacon has received the information that we're using by hacking into the CIA. Snake is still wary of all of this because it could be a trap in the end, and things are certainly fishy as Russians begin to arrive and kill the Marines on board, and Kasatka helicopters are flying above. As you can see, this is a far cry from where we began in MGS. There, Snake was officially working with the US government. Sure, in the end, he was a pawn, but he was part of an officially recognized team. Now he's sort of moved off the grid. He's only working with Otacon, the man that he met during the Shadow Moses incident. The Colonel is nowhere to be found, and their information isn't even necessarily certain, though we trust that we're in good hands. We're in Snake's hands and Otacon's hands. These are the good guys. They were the good guys when we met them in the first game, and they're still the good guys now, right? Snake's first goal is to move into the tanker and attempt to find the bridge. The crew is dead when we arrive, but the ship's location tells us that it's in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and we find out that the Marine Corps was working on this project alone. Snake sees a Russian woman on the deck. She's speaking over the radio to someone. The man tells her that Shalashaska has landed. The Russians have taken over the ship and placed explosives. We find out that she's talking to her father, Sergei Gorlukovich. The Russians plan to scuttle the tanker once they find out what they're looking for. This woman, Olga, wants to stay on the mission, and her father wants her to leave because she's pregnant. Of course, Snake confronts her after the call. She says that they are nomads and wanderers. Snake says that he is a nomad as well. This is once again an example of Snake relating to the enemy, a theme that will be even more present in this entry than it was in the last. Olga tries to use a trick knife to shoot Snake, and we have to do battle with her.
Not too shabby, is it? New York, I mean. And that brings our tour to its conclusion.
This is our first boss battle of the game, but we actually don't have a real pistol yet. We start the mission equipped with an M9, tranquilizer bullets only. We can shoot Olga once she pops out from cover, and eventually once she's full of enough tranq, she'll pass out. There's a lot of little things we can do here in this battle though, like targeting the hooks on the tarp to get her out of cover, or shooting out the light that she tries to point in our face. This is a massive step up for MGS2. It's general attention to detail. Most of the little tricks and secrets in MGS2 are pretty well known at this point, so I won't be going over every single one in this video, and I don't even really think that's within the scope of what I'm trying to do here, but there's a lot that can be done, and you can tell that the team was aiming for a game and a system that allowed you to find neat little tricks that either decreased the difficulty of dealing with enemies, or just rewarded the player with a funny little piece of content. There was no shortage of secrets in MGS, but MGS2 just bumps all of these things up to 11. And the examples I've used from the Olga fight aren't even really secrets, they're just part of the battle, but they feel like secrets. A lot of the appeal of this generation of Metal Gear games is the experience of playing the game, having an idea, trying it out, and being surprised when it actually works. This encourages creative approach, and while I think other games in the series would lean much farther into this sandbox style of design, MGS2 feels like a great balance of a linear narrative with a breadth of possibilities and variables in how you approach, or are forced to approach, situations. In the end, it's creative design that forces creative solutions from the player. Creativity from the developer encourages that same creativity from the user. Like I said though, a lot of the gameplay hasn't really changed. One of the biggest changes was actually the introduction of the first-person aiming mode. This revolutionized the series and would become a staple of how people play MGS games. MGS did not have this. The Twin Snakes version of the game did, but that was released post MGS2. This game introduced that style, and it can't be undersold. It changes so much in how you approach situations, how you take on enemies, how you manage your way through a ship full of guards and cameras. And honestly, this is probably a good time to talk about the tanker overall. Now, if you know anything about MGS2, you'll know that the game is split into two parts, the tanker and the plant. The tanker is the first part, and it's admittedly very short. There are a ton of little secrets to be found in just this chapter, but it can basically be completed in about an hour or two. The things we actually have to do are pretty straightforward, but there's a whole world here by itself. The upper levels, the outer deck, the below levels, there's so much here crammed into one little area. The tanker creates a really good ambiance. The fog that permeates the level creates an almost eerie feeling. Stalking the narrow, claustrophobic halls of the ship feels like something is waiting for you around the corner. The weather, the levels, the time of day, all of this affects the feeling that you get when you actually walk the tanker as Snake. Once we defeat Olga, we take her pistol, and now we actually have something lethal but unsuppressed. Snake gets a call from Otacon, who has identified Gurlukovich, Olga's father. He was the man that Otacon meant to meet with after the Shadow Moses incident. Snake is then seen by an army cipher, a small aerial machine that seems to be watching our main character. This really complicates things, as Snake already notes. We initially infiltrated a marine vessel, then the Russians showed up, and now we see an army presence. Snake even notes this himself, that things are getting convoluted, because it isn't just us against the bad guys anymore. To be honest, we don't even know who the bad guys are right now. Maybe the Russians are probably the worst party involved, but we don't really know what's going on right now, and that all furthers the mystery of MGS2. This is something that will become the main blood flow of the entire game, the mystery behind what's going on. And a lot of that mystery comes from the lack of information, but also the diverse parties that are involved in the conflicts ahead. We almost never have any idea of who's actually involved, who the actual bad guys or good guys are, or even who we're working for. The game purposefully muddies the waters so that the mystery it presents is stronger. Otacon then drops a massive bomb on us that the information he received was not originally from hacking into the CIA. It came from an anonymous tip, someone named EE. This is the nickname that Hal used to refer to his stepsister, one that he doesn't speak to anymore, but only they knew about this, so the information had to have some credence. He ended up hacking into the Pentagon to confirm the information. Once again, the situation has gotten even muddier, and we can't even be sure if we're here for a reason, or who sent us here in the first place. Snake is then sent down into the hold. We have to make our way into the lower decks, where we find a figure of Vulcan Raven and a body in a locker nearby. When we eventually arrive at a place that's armed with lasers and explosives, we have to shoot out the little control units that make the explosives work. We have to use the pistol that we got from Olga, and if we get here before we get that pistol, we won't be able to shoot out the units with our wimpy little tranquilizer gun. We then see some soldiers sealing a hatch and calling Gurlukovich. They must complete the preparations for their mystery plan before the speech ends, and they're also directed to keep Olga safe. We're then tasked with fighting these soldiers off, destroying them wave by wave, and Snake heads in through the hatch. Ocelot then arrives and kills a soldier that saw us go inside. Ocelot is the one they call Shalashaska. The revolver-wielding Enigma is back, one of the only members of the terrorist team to survive the Shadow Moses incident. When we get inside, we see the Marines being given a presentation by Dolph, the sergeant of this whole unit. Our goal is to get pictures of the Metal Gear in the next room, but Otacon tells us that someone has been listening in on our communications, but they haven't been interfering. We have 7 minutes to make our way around these rooms, avoiding the soldiers that are watching the screens ahead, but also avoiding the projectors. This, in some ways, feels like a throwback to MG2, avoiding the soldiers by distracting them with music or weaving through large amounts of enemy dummies. It's also incredibly intense. If we're spotted, then it's game over. In most cases, if we get spotted by an enemy, we at least have the opportunity to get away. When we finally get to see the new Metal Gear Ray, we have to get 4 shots of it. 3 from various angles on the front, and 1 specifically of the Marines logo on the weapon. When we get these pictures and transmit them to Otacon, Ocelot shows up, interrupting the presentation. Gurlukovich shows up pretty soon after. He claims to want the resurgence of Russia, the rise of his motherland. That's what he plans to use the weapon for. Ocelot then decides to reveal that he's been double-crossing the Russian. He actually wants to return the Metal Gear to a mysterious group called the Patriots. Dolph refers to them under a different name.
The Lale Lule Lo.
The Lale Lule Lo. Ocelot then kills both the commander and Sergei. He holds off the onslaught of soldiers trying to stop him and blows the explosives located on the ship. Before he can get into Metal Gear, Snake steps in, ready to stop this old foe that he's crossed paths with before. Snake's appearance causes something to change in Ocelot, though. If you notice, Ocelot has a new arm, a replacement for the one that Gray Fox severed in the first game. This arm, though, seems to take over him, and it causes the consciousness of Liquid Snake to come out. That's because it's Liquid's arm, and somehow his mind or state of being is still in there. Ocelot gets past this though, piloting the ray and destroying the tanker in the process. He then talks to the president once again, the same man that he was speaking to in the post-credits scene of MGS. Now, Metal Gear Solid had some pretty wacky moments. It wasn't exactly the most grounded game in the world, but Metal Gear Solid 2 is where things really start to go off the deep end. And honestly, I love it. The over-the-top narrative and insane story elements are really one of the best parts of the series. Most of the series is known for this style. It's become a meme at this point. The fact that people don't really understand the story of Metal Gear is just kind of accepted. And that isn't because it's convoluted beyond all belief. Well, actually, it kind of is. But it's also because the story is more about the effect and the meaning of this big, grand idea rather than the consequences or origins of those ideas alone. For example, Liquid surviving through his own arm isn't necessarily about the implications of consciousness in the Metal Gear world, and it definitely isn't about asking the question, how does that happen? But it's more about what happens when that thing does happen. It's about the opportunities for the story and the characters involved. Liquid has now managed to survive past his half-life, live through the Fox die, through the Shadow Moses incident, come out the other side and persevere, maybe to take revenge on his brother, maybe to finally overcome what he thinks are the genes holding him back, maybe some other mystery motivation that we're unaware of. In the last video, I talked a lot about how Metal Gear Solid's story rides the line between fun and substance. The game freely allows you to sink into its world and enjoy it in whichever way that you wish. This mostly applies to the entire series, but Metal Gear Solid 2 puts interest at the forefront. It consistently chooses both the most interesting option, but also the coolest option. Sometimes those two things don't overlap, but it manages to make the game cool in the way that a big blockbuster action movie is, while also being so over the top you can't really ever believe your eyes. Also, the idea that things might be so crazy and so unrealistic that we might start to mistrust the world around us is an idea that will come back towards the end of the game. But with that, we should probably talk about the next and longest section of the game, the plant. This chapter begins with a quote, one from the Smithsonian Museum, a specific exhibition titled Information Age: People, Information, and Technology. Scientists had to make thousands of calculations to create the atomic bomb and determine its effects. Computers and atomic bombs, both products of World War II, grew up together. This clearly sets the tone for the game, its story, and foreshadows a lot of the heavy themes that it will be dealing with. The Colonel is now telling Snake about the tanker sinking that we just saw, but it's 2 years later. This person is being called Snake, but they clearly aren't, as the voice sounds a lot different, but we'll get to that in a second.
What are their demands?
$30 billion.
$30 billion? What makes them think they can get that much?
The cover story for the tanker sinking was that terrorists blew a hole in an oil tanker and that a massive cleanup facility had to be put in its place. This was meant to reduce the environmental impact on the spilled oil. Obviously, we, as the player, know that this is partly bullshit. The Big Shell has been taken over by a group called Dead Cell. They were formerly an anti-terrorist training squad. They've demanded a ransom of $30 billion, which is just a comically large amount of money. They currently have 2 high-profile hostages, a VIP from a conservation group and James Johnson, the President of the United States. If the terrorists blow up the Big Shell, this will ignite the oil in the water, blow up the Manhattan harbor, and release tons of incredibly harmful toxins that will effectively destroy the ecosystem in the bay. Our 2 main objectives are to rescue the hostages and to ensure that the terrorists don't have the means to blow up the Big Shell. This new Snake character is part of Foxhound, but SEAL Team 10 is also present here. We can't make them aware of our mission or presence. Snake's name is quickly changed to Raiden for this mission because, well, he really isn't Snake, and it would get pretty confusing pretty quickly. This man is named Jack, and he's sort of Snake's replacement in this entry, as Snake was assumingly on the tanker when it went down. At this point, he's been presumed dead, and officially on the record, they found his body. So instead of playing Snake, we'll be playing Raiden. Now, this was a pretty massive controversy at the time. A lot of fans absolutely did not like having to play Raiden instead of the fan favorite Solid Snake. There were many reasons for this, but it's a deep issue, so let's get to the root of it. First was the idea of a bait and switch. When MGS2 was shown off at E3, they really only showed the tanker section. Raiden was completely kept hidden from the public. This was honestly probably a smart idea on the part of the team, because if most people knew you wouldn't be playing Snake for a majority of the game, they probably wouldn't have had the same sales as Metal Gear Solid. Snake himself had not only become a hero in the world of Metal Gear for his legendary actions in Outer Heaven, Zanzibar, and Shadow Moses, but in the real world. Fans viewed Snake as the cool, stylish, and brooding protagonist that they wanted. He was gaming's biggest action hero, and playing as him was a big draw. When players got their hands on MGS2 and then played him for a couple of hours before being swapped to playing some random dude, it's safe to say they were a little mad. A lot of this just comes from feeling like they were misled, and honestly, they kind of were, but there was a reason they were being misled. Playing as Raiden, removing the ability to play as Snake from the player, these are things that tie into the overall narrative and themes of the game. This is again something we'll get to towards the end of this video, but if you just started playing the game or maybe never finished it, it would be understandable that you'd be upset. The second reason was how people perceived Raiden. At the time, there was definitely the perception that Raiden was kind of girly. This is even referenced by Shinkawa in the behind-the-scenes documentary that was made for MGS2. This is in due part to the design of his face, his long white hair, and the juxtaposition between him and Snake. When you look at Snake, you see a man's man. He's rugged, cool, mostly silent, doesn't talk about his problems, just charges headfirst in and tries to help. He even smokes cigarettes. He's the archetype of an action hero, characters that were mostly created out of the pure form and idea of rugged manliness. Raiden is kind of the opposite. He's clean-shaven, has long white hair, kind of has a high-pitched voice. The immediate comparison that enters your mind when you begin playing as him is that of Snake, because you can't help but compare him to the only other main character in this series so far. This makes him seem a lot more girly in comparison. And the final reason that people seem to hate Raiden so much at the time was his personality. Raiden is a soldier that has been trained using VR simulations. He's never actually seen the field before. Many people will confront him about this through the course of our mission, often with worry in their voice at the thought that this is technically his first real mission.
Every year, a few soldiers die in field exercises.
There's pain sensation in VR and even a sense of reality and urgency. The only difference is it isn't actually happening.
He will argue, though, that VR is very lifelike and that there's no difference between that and real combat. And this comes off as naive. Sometimes he can even be a little whiny. And all of these things, the bait and switch, the comparison with Snake's design, and even his personality all have reasons for being here. They are valid in the context of MGS2, its themes, its messages. It's all important, and those themes wouldn't hit nearly as hard if we were playing as Snake. It's just the nature of the story that Kojima designed. Kojima himself says the reason Raiden was included was so that they could distance the player from Snake. Getting away from Snake allows the game to deal with different things, tell different stories, and provoke new emotions. I personally really like Raiden as a character. He plays the role that he was meant to play in this story, and he's something we'll come back to a lot as we progress through this game. And public discourse around his character and MGS2 as a whole has changed a lot throughout the years. He's definitely not hated as much now as he was back then. As Raiden enters the facility, he can see that someone else has already taken this method of approach. Raiden's been outfitted with something called the Skull Suit, a piece of sneaking equipment with biofeedback, blood loss data, and sensor smart skin. we need to head up top in the big shell to get this intrusion mission going. Before we do that though, we're introduced to a new feature called nodes.
A node.
Did you say nerd?
Not nerd. Node.
Oh.
Since we don't naturally have access to the map data of the areas that we'll be traveling through, we need to collect that data from pieces of machinery called nodes. These are located in each of the areas throughout the big shell. Once we get the data from the node, it'll become much easier to get around guards and traverse the area. Some specific areas are a massive pain in the ass to get around without being seen when you don't have the radar yet. I'm looking at you, Strut F Warehouse. Before we move on, we should quickly talk about the big shell itself. The whole base is made up of two large platforms called shells. We begin on shell 1. Each shell is made up of multiple rooms connected by bridges that form a large hexagon. In turn, both shells are connected by one long bridge. Each room on the outside is referred to as a strut, and they all have names: strut A, B, C, so on and so forth. So at any given time, if a character tells us to rush to strut H or C, we can immediately know where we're going as we now have access to a larger map. Each of the struts also have cores located at the center with multiple floors and levels. The whole thing has a very cold design, its main color being this orange yellow, kind of feels like rust or hazard warnings. It's chemical in aesthetic, but also in feeling. It's the same aura as a yellow mop bucket with a slip sign or a reflective vest on a construction worker. Industrial. This is by design, and I think the shell was meant to be sort of icy in a way. It feels very foreign to the environments that we saw before, and that doesn't mean that some environments through the plant will not vary, because they will change along with certain story elements. But for the most part, it's a stark contrast to invading Shadow Moses at night. The dark light, the snowfall, the gray and green color palette. The island felt kind of homey in a particular way. It almost didn't feel real. The plant feels a lot more like real life, like something you might see in the world rather than in an action film. As Raiden advances through the plant, he quickly learns that there are Gurlukovich soldiers here. If you recognize that name, it's because Sergei Gurlukovich and his daughter were part of the tanker chapter. Since Sergei's death, they have become soldiers without a home. We're then introduced to really the only other support member of our team, who is named Rose. Rose happens to be Jack's girlfriend, and she's here to assist us with saves.
What are you doing here?
Jack, can you hear me?
Rose, you're not supposed to be involved. What's going on?
Jack, I'm a part of this mission.
Colonel, what the hell is going on?
Raiden does not want her to be here at all. He thinks the conflict is incredibly inappropriate and that she doesn't have a place here. But the original analyst was in an accident, so she was the only one available. Rose is also here to make sure Raiden is safe and is keeping a record of every codec conversation that Raiden has. Rose also makes a point to ask Raiden if he knows what day it is tomorrow. He doesn't think it's anything important, but obviously she does, and she won't tell him until he figures it out. To get to the upper levels of the big shell, we have to head up an elevator. We're forced to hide from guards until the elevator arrives, which is almost eerily like the first sequence in MGS. This is the moment at which Raiden takes his mask off and he is fully revealed to the player. The moment at which the player also realizes that they are not playing Snake, at least officially. As we reach the roof of Strut A, we are updated on the situation at hand. The terrorists on board the Big Shell have taken to calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, and they are being led by Solid Snake himself. The Colonel doesn't believe it could be the same Solid Snake, as he died during the tanker incident. The President, the most important hostage we need to rescue, has been spotted at Strut B. We patch into SEAL Team 10's comms to hear that they do have the President in tow, but they are ambushed and killed. We then have to head to Strut B ourselves. Raiden arrives to find the bodies of dead SEALs everywhere. We see a man here named Vamp. Vamp is, well, he's a vampire. I know that sounds a bit crazy, like we just took things up about 5 notches all at once, and we kind of did, but just strap in because it gets wilder. Vamp is currently killing the SEAL team, but Vamp is pulled away by a woman. Raiden ends up meeting one of the SEALs. His name is Iroquois Pliskin, and he looks a bit familiar, doesn't he? I'm not sure if this was exactly a reveal at the time. I couldn't find many people's reaction to this scene. I'm not sure whether people knew this was Snake right away, but I mean, obviously this is Snake. I guess maybe if you were playing MGS2 for the first time, you might be questioning it a little bit, thinking that it's possibly some sort of clone twin or something, but this is in fact Solid Snake. I'll just reveal it here, but he did survive the tanker incident, and he's snuck into the big shell, working with his own motives and reasons for being here. Obviously, this probably fueled the Raiden hatred a little more as well, because Snake is right here. People most likely felt that they could have reasonably played Snake within this story because, well, he's already in it. But again, there are reasons for this that we'll get to in due time. Pliskin asks Raiden if he's in Foxhound and is surprised that the unit isn't abandoned yet. We get a bit more of Raiden's background here as well, as he defends his VR training and its realism.
There's pain sensation in VR and even a sense of reality and urgency. The only difference is it isn't actually happening.
That's the way they want you to think, to remove you from the fear that goes with battle situations. War is a video game. What better way to raise the ultimate soldier?
So you're saying that VR training is some kind of mind control?
Raiden then checks in with the Colonel. He tells him about the President and the fate of SEAL Team 10. Pliskin is going to have to stay back to recover, but he can still give us some vital information, especially on the vampire that we just saw. He's Romanian, and Snake describes him as a wizard with knives. He says that the group he's a part of, Dead Cell, was an anti-terrorist unit, but their leader died in prison and the group began to unravel. They started going after allies to the US and civilians. 6 months ago, they were obliterated, and now there's only 3 of them left. One large contrast that MGS2 has on the first game is that it doesn't introduce us to the cast of villains right from the get-go. In MGS, we're introduced to Foxhound right away. Each member is basically laid out for us. We have the intel on these characters, and we're allowed to sort of build them up in our mind before we can meet them. Here, that's not the case. We're slowly introduced to the villains over the course of the story. We'll see Vamp many more times before we actually face him. This definitely fits the story of Metal Gear Solid 2 much better. It adds to the mystery of MGS2 a lot, and again, it makes us question just about everything with the narrative. Kojima stated that he wanted to introduce a lot of different parties in the game to make the player question who was actually good and who was bad. This works for the most part because we don't really know who is who. It also makes Raiden feel more clueless. He doesn't know what's going on, which is even more important. Throughout the story, he'll receive critical information from people that aren't the Colonel or his support team. This sows more distrust with Raiden's superiors, which will be very important as the story reaches its final chapters. As we head outside, we see a woman called Fortune, another one of the Dead Cell members. She's begging to be shot, but none of the shots fired at her actually hit. Vamp ends up taking the President away, and she blows up the bridge to the Shell 1 core.
Today is another bad day. Is there anyone here that can give me happiness?
We now have a new objective. There's C4 all over the big shell, and it seems like the terrorists are planning to take the whole thing out. We have to disable the explosives with the help of an explosives professional located on Strut C. The professional's name is Peter Stillman, and he's a legend in the bomb disposal world. He ended up retiring after a failed bomb disposal in a church, but he's back to help us out here. Primarily because the man that placed the bombs and the third member of Dead Cell is his student, Fat Man. He's referred to as the Emperor of Explosives. They had a really deep relationship, and Stillman felt like he was training his own son.
I didn't teach him the most important thing I had to tell him. There are some things you have to pass on. The trick is to know which one.
Stillman knows what Fat Man's signature is, though. He leaves a cologne scent on each of the bombs that he places. It's like a calling card. We have a sensor that will let us detect where the bombs are placed. Pliskin decides to head over to Shell 2, while we take care of Shell 1. There are 6 bombs on each shell, 1 on each of the struts. Stillman is going to stay back and give out instructions, even though he wants to get out there and help. He's missing a leg and will be too slow to move out there. As Pliskin leaves, Stillman notes that the things he says don't necessarily line up. He said 2 things, Semper Fi and Who Dares Win. One is a SEAL motto, and the other is something that the British Special Air Service state. He doesn't quite think he's an enemy, but he certainly isn't who he says he is. It's Snake, guys. He's Solid Snake. It's a solid snake. Stillman has some pretty great quotes here about bomb disposal, and not just viewing it as an ideology.
Bomb disposal is a face-off with your own mortality. Don't let the fear get to you. When you give in to the fear, the darkness comes.
When we find the first bomb in the women's bathroom of the same strut, Stillman notes that the bomb placements are unexpected. They're not on any place with structural importance. This starts to become a trend as we find each of the bombs. With all of the explosive devices, we must aim the coolant spray at them and freeze them until they turn off. As we go to each of the struts, we get a call from Rose, who chooses the worst time possible to work through her relationship problems with Raiden, and an anonymous benefactor who tells us about the mines ahead of us. They first call themselves Deep Throat, but Raiden recognizes this name from the Shadow Moses incident, so they go by Mr. X. In another similarity to the first event, they refer to themselves as one of our fans. Raiden then runs into Olga on the roof of Strut E. It seems that she survived the tanker incident, and she's talking to someone on the radio. Apparently she saw someone dressed as a cyborg ninja. Maybe it's our Mr. X. She also saw Pliskin running around in a cardboard box. We confront her and she claims that she isn't a part of Dead Cell before she gets away. When we get to the last bomb, Pliskin calls us to tell us that he found a ton of C4 hidden under Strut 2, and it didn't have the cologne scent, so it wouldn't have showed up on the sensors. Stillman decides to go to Shell 2 to try and find the hidden bombs, but he'll never make it. He's only got 1 leg, but apparently this isn't true. Stillman reveals that he's been living a lie. He never lost his leg in the explosion at the church, but there were victims. He felt like a failure for not doing his job. This led him to seek out victimhood so that he would be removed of blame. He wore this tragedy like a shell, hoping that no one could penetrate the thick exterior he had created for himself. His shame was formed into an armor, and now he's decided to let that armor go. Stillman is a really interesting character because he's not exactly a good guy. In the context of the mission, he is. He's trying to save lives by helping us disabling bombs. So at first appearance, he's on the good guy team, the blue team, not the red. But when this reveal comes up, he admits to kind of doing one of the worst things you can do. I mean, he's been faking being disabled for sympathy. That's definitely wrong. But because we got to know him first, and because of his efforts to help people here, we are allowed to have sympathy for him. We understand why he did this, why he's lived this lie, and we can see that it's weighed on him just as much. Making an irredeemable character look good in the eyes of the player is pretty difficult, but MGS2 manages to do this well, with a character that really doesn't have the largest significance in the grand scheme of things. Once we get the final C4, Stillman says that he found a bunch more in Shell 2. He believes that the same thing is in Shell 1. Also, apparently, if one strut from each shell gets blown up, then the whole thing will collapse under its weight. I'm not exactly a structural engineer, so I'm just going to trust that Kojima knew what he was talking about here. At this point, we have to get to the second sensor, sensor B, that we can use to find the non-cologne smelling bombs. Stillman is still trying to figure out what the other bombs are about, but then Pliskin freezes the last bomb he had to find on this strut. This confirms Stillman's suspicions that the distraction bombs were hooked to a detonator, and the real bombs would be armed when they were all deactivated. We have 300 seconds to get to the bottom of Strut A and deactivate the C4 there. Now, we'll spend a lot of the first half of the plant chapter running back and forth around Shell 1. Some of this will be backtracking, and some of it will be discovering new struts or areas of old struts. One massive complaint that most people had with the first MGS game was that there was far too much backtracking, and that the game felt a bit long in its second half because of it. I didn't feel like the backtracking was that bad, mostly because it had its reasons for being there, but the second game mostly does away with this feeling entirely. At least from my perspective, the game doesn't ever really make you feel like you're backtracking. Technically, at certain points, you are, maybe to run back to strut A to find the hidden bomb, to run back to strut F to get the sniper, etc., etc. But it really isn't that often, and sometimes the environments change. The game also, again, generally uses it as a way to deliver more story in the meantime. This is similar to Metal Gear Solid, but what also really makes Metal Gear Solid 2 different. One big contrast is the obvious, that there's not two giant elevators that we have to ride during that backtracking segment, but it's mostly just that the game has removed the tedium from backtracking. There's purpose, there's a reason to go back, and adding intensity in the form of a bomb timer helps as well. This feels like drive. This feels like reason. You're not thinking of the fact that you're seeing these same areas again because there's a fucking timer counting down that's going to explode the entire place if we don't hurry. There's no time to think. In this way, the game does sort of obscure the backtracking beneath little things. It's hidden, so it isn't as prevalent. Also, the design of the Big Shell feels more like an open world rather than a linear layout of levels. Shadow Moses was mostly rooms in front of each other, continuing in a long line. The Big Shell is laid out in two circles. This feels more like an open area that we're allowed to traverse in any way we please, rather than a straight line of rooms that we're forced to go back through. This is probably the biggest factor in removing the feeling of backtracking, and goes a long way in making the game's story feel natural as it progresses. On our way to grab the bomb in Strut A, Stillman calls to reveal that the bombs he was inspecting were a trap. They're about to be set off and he only has 30 seconds, no time left. The central section of Shell 2 has now begun to flood as a result of the explosion. We finally reach the bomb in Strut A and disable it. Hostages are now being killed, one every hour. Pliskin has gone dark and the Colonel wants us to just leave him and go out on our own. Before we head back up above ground, Fortune is waiting for us. She once again says that she wants death. She seemingly can't die, can't be hit by bullets, or really anything. Someone is responsible for killing her father, but it isn't Raiden. She's looking for Snake. We have a boss battle with Fortune here, but shooting at her won't do anything, so we have to just avoid her attacks until it's all over. At this point, Fortune says that Fat Man is requesting Raiden's presence. There's 400 seconds left until he sets off the final bomb. Vamp arrives telling Fortune that Fat Man has gone rogue, no longer aligning himself with Dead Cell's motives. Raiden shoots at Fortune, but the bullet misses her and hits Vamp. Fortune has Lady Luck on her side. Her character is based around the fact that she can't die because she is so lucky. Nothing will ever hit her. No bullet will pierce her skin. But this causes a truly painful existence. Immortality as a curse rather than a blessing. She sees everyone around her die. Everyone around her goes away while she stays. She begs for death because it's the only solace that she has left. The only luck that can never smile upon her is the peace of death. Vamp dies here in her stead, and Fortune's mourning allows Raiden to get out. But Vamp can't die either. Why? Because he's a fucking vampire. Duh.
There's no need for sorrow, Queen. I died once already.
When we arrive at the heliport and defuse Fat Man's actual final bomb, he arrives. He shares a lot of Stillman's beliefs, the bomb disposal as an ideology, but this is rather applied to bomb planting and explosions than the tinkering and disabling of them. And if my reverence for Kojima is ever too much, just know that I generally save it for things like this, where the art of bombs is talked about with such romance, such admiration, enough acclaim to make one actually believe it.
Bombs tell the time with every moment of their existence, and nothing else announces its own end with such a fanfare.
Fat Man says that he doesn't really care about the money or ransom. We then have what is our really first true boss battle of the plant chapter. Fat Man is determined to beat Raiden after he disposed of all of his bombs. He will skate around the heliport. A large man in heavy armor on roller skates is truly a sight to behold. Our only way to damage him is to shoot him multiple times and then aim for his head when he's on the ground. But he will also plant bombs around the place. We have to disable these because if any of them goes off, it's game over. It's not too much to manage, and it feels incredibly satisfying to catch Fat Man from afar, to stun him and then take a chunk of his life. When he's down, we aren't exactly done. He says that he's placed one more bomb, one actual, real, final explosive left. The last bomb is actually under Fat Man's body. We have to move him to get it, and when we do move him, Stillman's dog tags are dropped, showing that he truly did kill his mentor. Once this is over, the Colonel claims that Fat Man must have been kept in the dark about the ransom. Our new mission is to head to the Shell 1 core and rescue the President. We then get an update from Pliskin. He was out cold, and somebody that he calls friend helped him out. The bomb has now destroyed Strut H on Shell 2. Something strange happens here, though. When asked, Pliskin doesn't know anything about the toxins that could be released upon a bomb explosion. This is in direct contrast to what the Colonel told us, so who is wrong here? The two start to develop a plan to get the hostages out of the big shell through the use of a helicopter, but they'll have to make multiple trips. When Raiden leaves the heliport, we're met with a cyborg ninja, one that looks almost identical to Gray Fox from Metal Gear Solid. The ninja even says,
"I'm like you, I have no name."
Something that Gray Fox said.
"I'm like you, I have no name."
This is the mysterious benefactor, Mr. X. He claims to be a messenger from the Lali Lule Lo. The only place we've heard that was in the Tanker chapter from Dolph. Mr. X was ordered to give Raiden backup. He tells us to go to the Shell 1 core to find Agent Ames, the only person that knows where the President is being held. The only way we can tell which hostage he is by the sound of his heartbeat. He has a pacemaker, so we'll be able to tell the difference. We're given an enemy uniform so that we can sneak inside as one of them. Apparently, the terrorists already have a nuke, and the code to launch said nuke. Mr. X also tells us that there is a Metal Gear housed in the big shell, of course, because why wouldn't there be? And on top of all of that, he says that Dead Cell are not what they seem, and that the big shell is not a cleanup facility. Mr. X has virtually just broken Raiden's entire world and brain. Most everything he's been told is a lie. No toxins that will destroy the ecosystem of the bay. No cleanup facility. Dead Cell or something else. It's all beginning to break down around him. Of course, Raiden would want answers from the Colonel, but he doesn't know anything. This is standard fare for most Metal Gear games. Snake hears something that contradicts what he's heard, he contacts the Colonel, and the Colonel is dumbfounded. He doesn't know who Mr. X is, and he's never heard of a Metal Gear being housed here. The only thing Raiden can do at this point is to head to Shell 1 and try to find Ames, to try and get answers, and possibly save the most important man in the country. We have to head back to Strut F to get the AK, and we have to get the directional mic from the core of Shell 1. Once we have all of these things, we can head down to where the hostages are being held. Using the directional mic, we can find the heartbeat that stands out among the rest, and we can contact Ames. Ames was also sent by the Lali Lule Lo, another member of this mysterious group that we have no idea about. While they have this conversation, Ocelot is watching from above. Ames says that the case and code that they have for the nuclear launch is also for the new Metal Gear. They need the President to authorize this code though, and if he's dead, it won't work, so they won't touch him now. He's on the first floor of the Shell 2 core. Ames then breaks some more of the information that we've received so far. The tanker, the oil spill, and even the big shell were all in service of developing an entirely new Metal Gear. At this point, we can listen into the conversation between Ocelot and the terrorist leader, who supposedly goes by the name Solid Snake. These two are talking about Fat Man's betrayal, and they really just think that Dead Cell are a bunch of psychos. The two are using them as a tool rather than working with them. Snake thinks that the Patriots are behind whoever is sneaking around on the Big Shell, which is Raiden and the real Snake, who's called Pliskin. Okay, it might be a little confusing, but just stick with me here. Their plan seems to be to restore Outer Heaven, the idea that Big Boss had all those years ago. Olga then shows up. She also says that they are not aware of the ninja running around. Once again, like Gray Fox, the ninja is a middle party outside of this whole thing. Olga and Ocelot are not really working well together, as Olga harbors resentment against Revolver since he was there in the tanker when her father died. Ocelot's arm then begins to take over, the one with Liquid's consciousness inside of it. He has a way to deal with it now, though, by shocking the thing. Snake then heads off to take care of the intruder, and Ames tells Raiden that the whole story about the ransom money was a fake. The real goal was a nuclear strike the entire time. The terrorists want to set off a nuke in the atmosphere above Manhattan, taking out all of the electrical equipment in the city. This will then allow them to liberate the city, taking it for themselves. At this point, he gives us a key that will give us access to Shell 2. Ocelot then becomes aware of Raiden's presence. Ocelot believes that Ames was sent here on purpose, and Ames dies of what seems like a heart attack. Ocelot unmasks Raiden, and Mr. X steps in, almost cutting off Ocelot's arm, but he sees it coming this time. Mr. X helps Raiden get out unharmed. The Colonel is once again naive to all of the information that we have just learned. He's starting to think that this might have been a cover-up. Our goal is now to get to the President. At this point, he might be working with the terrorists, but it's the only lead we have. We head to the connecting bridge between Shell 1 and Shell 2, and we're contacted by Pliskin. He's grabbed one of the enemy helicopters, and Otacon is with him. Rose then tells Raiden who Otacon is, but Raiden refuses to believe that Snake and Otacon were terrorists that blew up the tanker. It seems like that's the official story that circulated after the incident. Raiden realizes some sort of higher purpose here, though. He realizes that to complete a mission like that, you have to have some strength of will. The Colonel steps in to refute this. Snake's body was recovered at the tanker site, exact DNA match. If that's true, then who is Pliskin and who is Snake? Well, we're going to find out pretty soon. We have to snipe out the control boxes for a ton of explosives that are on the bridge. Some of them are hidden behind waving flags or placed on ciphers. When we do this, we finally meet Solid Snake. It's not really Solid Snake though, it's Solidus Snake. Solidus is the same person that Ocelot was talking to at the end of Metal Gear Solid. He's the third genetic clone of Big Boss, technically Snake and Liquid's brother. He plans to surpass Big Boss himself, and the real Snake, who at this point I'll just call Snake because fuck it, is upset that Solidus is impersonating him. Solidus avoids all of the explosions tossed his way and jumps into a Harrier jet that Vamp is piloting. We're armed with a Stinger as a gift from Snake, and we have our second real boss fight of the plant chapter. Before we get to that, I just want to do a bit of a recap to get clear exactly where we're at on this whole situation. Like I said before, Kojima specifically stated that the parties involved in MGS2, the people at the heart of the situation, were purposefully obscured so that the player could not tell who was good and who was bad. This was mostly true for Metal Gear Solid as well, but it was a lot more clear there. We were against Foxhound, and we were working with our support team. Sure, you had outliers like Liquid being the mole, Naomi being an odd third party, and Gray Fox being, well, Gray Fox. But for the most part, it was us against the bad guys. Here, it's way more complicated. So first of all, we have Raiden, our main character, who is working with the Colonel and Rose. These are effectively what I'll call the good guys for now. Raiden is our protagonist. He's basically an avatar for the player. He isn't bad, and we know that almost for a fact. The Colonel seems to be hiding something, or at worst, completely ignorant of a lot of really important information. Campbell has shown in past entries that he doesn't know everything, or sometimes lies because he has to, but he's rarely deliberately obscuring information to work for the other side. It's usually the greater good overall, so we most likely know that he isn't lying. And Rose is Jack's girlfriend, so of course she's on our side, and she hasn't really said anything to make us think otherwise. Then we have Dead Cell. Dead Cell so far is made up of Fortune, Vamp, and Fat Man, who is now dead. Dead Cell are mostly the bad guys from what we've seen. Vamp was literally killing people in front of us, and Fat Man was trying to explode the entire Big Shell. Fortune is a little different. She did try to kill us, but she hasn't done anything particularly bad so far. Okay, maybe she did kill some seals, so she's a bad guy too. Then we have the in-between. We have Snake or Pliskin and Otacon. They seem to be working together. Snake has helped us so far, but we're being told that he was a terrorist. Now, as a player, we know what really happened on the tanker, for the most part, so we know that Snake isn't a bad guy definitively, and he's given us mostly the truth so far. So these guys are somewhere in the gray middle area. Mr. X is also here, in the same place that Gray Fox would have gone in the first game, some sort of odd third party that has their own motives, or at least the motives of some other mysterious party. Solidus and Ocelot are effectively on the bad guy side, as Ocelot was stealing Metal Gear, sunk the tanker, killed Sergei and Dolph, and is now trying to seemingly take over Manhattan. Solidus is doing the same and seems to be taking on a similar role to Liquid in the first game. Olga also seems to be on the bad guy side, or at least that's how the game has framed her so far. I mean, she can't exactly be a good guy if she's working with Solidus. But the real question is, who are all these people working for? Ocelot and Solidus seem to be working together. Dead Cell seems to be on their own, used by Ocelot and Solidus. Olga is working with Solidus and Ocelot. Raiden is working with the Colonel and Rose. But that leaves all the people in the middle as a mystery. They aren't working with us, but they aren't working with the opposition. Now, this is not the blurriest that things will get. Reveals will be made, people will change sides, and things will be a lot more complicated in the end. But I think this is a good visual, because as I was stating where these people end up, a lot of them are still up for interpretation. We don't fully trust the Colonel, we don't fully trust Snake, and some of the bad guys don't seem entirely terrible. It's complicated, it's messy, it's convoluted, but it's done on purpose, to obscure the truth, to keep the mystery of Metal Gear Solid 2 going for as long as it can. The Harrier fight then takes place on the connecting bridge between Shell 1 and Shell 2. We're armed with the Stinger, which uses lock-on missiles. We have to shoot the Harrier until it goes down. It will rain fire on us from above, launching missiles at the bridge and even destroying parts of it during our battle. Snake and Otacon are assisting us from the Kasatka as well. Metal Gear, up until this point, has always been about pushing and shifting the technology that it could. The last few games have always felt like a leap forward in what could be achieved with games. Whether those achievements were felt through narrative or whether they were felt through fidelity doesn't really matter because they were always pushing. MGS2 certainly pushes in terms of fidelity and narrative as well, but the Hind D fights in the series have always been the best example of this. Looking at the Hind D fight in MG1 to MG2, and then finally Metal Gear Solid, you see drastic changes each time. But here, we're not even fighting a Hind D anymore. We're so far off the map. We're now fighting a jet that's lightning fast and equipped with powerful weapons. And of course, this battle just oozes the action movie style that these games have always tried to achieve. Launching rockets at a jet with a helicopter assisting us, it doesn't get much cooler than this. Once we take the jet down, Solidus has lost an eye and the jet begins to crash into the water before a Metal Gear Ray jumps out of the water and catches it. Vamp then gets out of the wreckage and heads into Shell 2. We then finally get to talk to Snake now that Raiden has realized he isn't really named Iroquois Pliskin, but Snake doesn't exactly adopt his old moniker willingly.
Legend. A legend is nothing but fiction. Someone tells it, someone else remembers, everybody passes it on.
I'm here because I was assigned to this mission, not because I want to. If I could, I'd be out of here in a second. How could you come back to all this? Why keep fighting?
There's something my best friend said to me once.
What?
We're not tools of the government or anyone else. Fighting was the only thing I was good at, but at least I always fought for what I believed in.
Snake explains that the body they found in the tanker wreckage was Liquid's body. They used it to fool the authorities into thinking it was Snake's body because they share the same genetic makeup. So the Colonel was wrong. Otacon and Snake got information on a new Metal Gear prototype and showed up here to stop the terrorists from hijacking it. They also got information that Otacon's sister was captured here, making things a bit more personal. The Colonel says that our goal is now to find the president and stop him from giving the password to the terrorists. The Colonel then starts to lash out at Raiden. It seems that Campbell is a bit more temperamental in this entry than he was before. He never really talked to Snake like this. Is it just because he has less respect for Raiden, or is it something more? When we reach the Shell 2 core, we find Olga talking to Ocelot over the phone. Olga's motives are revealed here. She is planning on using the ransom money for Russia when this is all over. She also wants to take out Snake because she thinks he killed her father on the tanker. The floor in front of the room where the president is being kept is electrocuted. We must get the Nikita missile launcher from the flooded hallways below and use it to guide a missile inside the room, turning off the floor. If you think this feels a lot like past entries, you're right, and that's something we'll get to in a bit. When we find President Johnson, The president admits that he was working with the terrorists at first. He was trying to get more power, but they wanted too much destruction for his tastes. At the end of the day, he's a figurehead, and figureheads don't have power. The real people in power are the Patriots. The Patriots are a shadow organization that has been controlling things from behind the scenes. They put George Sears into office before Johnson. George Sears is Solidus himself, but Solidus had orchestrated the Shadow Moses incident, and the Patriots removed him in response. The formal story was that he resigned, but the formal stories are rarely the whole truth. Johnson says that presidential races are well-scripted dramas, staged for the benefit of the public. Very few even know of the Patriots' existence, but they control everything. Even Johnson doesn't know who the members are, but there are 12 people called the Wise Men's Committee. Solidus had a goal: to challenge the Patriots. After that, he was pulled out of office. He went off-grid and began working with Ocelot. He's trying to take the new Metal Gear to take the Patriots head-on. The Metal Gear we saw in the water earlier was Metal Gear Ray. That is not the new Metal Gear, something larger. The whole big shell itself is the new Metal Gear, called Arsenal Gear. It's protected by mass-produced Metal Gear Rays. Arsenal is more of an idea than a weapon. It's supposed to be the core of the country, as the Patriots feel very threatened by the arrival of the digital age. Arsenal was developed as a method to control the flood of new information. GW is a system within Metal Gear, the key to the entire program, but not much is known about it specifically. Emma Emmerich, Otacon's sister, was a key engineer on Arsenal Gear. Our goal is now to find her. Johnson gives us a disc that has a virus on it. This virus should disrupt GW and Arsenal. It's been modeled after Fox Die, but we have to get to Emma first. At this point, the president wants us to take his life, as it's the only way stopping the terrorists from getting the code to Arsenal. Ocelot comes in and kills him anyways.
Forget him. He did us a favor. Without free will, there is no difference between submission and rebellion. My only real choice is to put an end to this charade. Let me at least have the freedom to end it myself.
We get a new directive from the Colonel to put an end to Arsenal Gear at all costs. The Colonel already knew about the project, but he couldn't tell us, so he confirms that he was hiding information, as usual. We're going to talk about this much more at the end of the video, but one of my favorite parts about this game is how it increases the threat from Metal Gear Solid. Metal Gear Solid was more about the nuclear threat overall, the idea of an incredibly powerful and destructive weapon. That's what's been at the core of the series this whole time, and it's still about that, but it's twisted in a new way that modernizes the idea a little bit. It's not just a weapon that's launching nukes, it's a weapon that controls a much more abstract concept than human life. It controls information. Before we head to find Emma, we get to talk to Snake and Otacon. Snake tells us that they were framed for the tanker incident 2 years ago. The pictures that we took in that mission were put online, but the press spun the story, making Snake look like the villain. The Patriots wanted to bring Snake's image down. They were afraid of a loose cannon. The Patriots also wanted to get rid of Metal Gear Ray because it was a Navy project, and they were behind Arsenal Gear. Otacon also tells us a bit about his sister Emma. She was a computer whiz and specialized in neural AI. He isn't quite sure how she got wrapped up in this weapons development thing, but he does warn us that she's afraid of water, which is terrible because she's in a flooded area of the facility. She got this fear when she was a child. She was swimming and almost drowned. Otacon wasn't around, but she was shouting for him and he couldn't hear her. Otacon hasn't seen her since that day. When we swim through the underwater hallways, we eventually run into Vamp, who is ready to fight Raiden because he sees a worthy opponent in the operative. He tells Raiden that Arsenal Gear is armed with a hydrogen bomb, a secret project that Solidus doesn't know about. We have to defeat Vamp in a square room. There's a small pool of water that he'll dive into in the middle. We can't go into this water because it's microbial or something, and we'll sink to the bottom, fitting the theme of drowning that we just talked about. We can shoot Vamp while he jumps around the room, shoot him while he's in the water, or while he's attacking. Using explosives here is incredibly effective and useful. Once Vamp is dead, we can go find Emma, but Rose chooses, once again, the worst time in the world to go over her and Jack's relationship issues. Rose is worried that Jack doesn't feel close to her, that he closes himself off to keep her at a distance. Raiden just says that he's scared of the night and has things that pick at him. We then find Emma hiding in a locker. Raiden gains her trust, and we can see quickly how much she reveres her older brother. She even wears glasses she doesn't need because she thinks they look cool. We then have a sequence where we have to swim with Emma on our back. If we aren't in the water, then we lead her by the hand. It really isn't bad as far as escort missions of this era go. Swimming with Emma just requires hitting the right pockets of air in the water so she doesn't drown, and leading her along really just requires making sure that the way is clear first. Halfway through, Emma reflects on her time with her brother. They were best friends and felt like real siblings, even though they were only siblings through marriage. The relationship was clearly very influential on both people, Emma remembering her older brother very fondly, and Otacon remembering Emma as a very close sister. We eventually lead Emma to Strut L. She needs to get the virus into the system so that it can work on Arsenal Gear. The only way there, because of the previous explosions to Strut H, is below, on the oil fence. She eventually tells us that she was the one that created GW. The whole system, Arsenal included, is about controlling and deleting specific information. She says that they have already begun to alter public perception of verified information. This will be incredibly important moving forward, but for now, it's the goal of the Patriots. GW is actually more important than Arsenal Gear itself. Arsenal is just a way to protect the GW system. GW is the thing that's actually meant to control the information. Emma says that the Patriots installed a program on everyone's computers during the Y2K event, a countermeasure that people willingly accepted. GW needed all this complex data to be completed, and the people behind it were planning something else as a final test to get it ready. Emma then finally gives us a level 5 card to get us through the final doors, and tells us that she has a parrot in the Shell 1 core, the place that she has to install the virus. Our goal here is to guard Emma while she crosses over the oil fence. While she walks on narrow pathways above the water, we have to snipe out C4 before she reaches it, destroy ciphers and snipers that are above her. Before she can reach the other side where Snake is waiting for her, Vamp jumps out of the water and grabs her. We have to shoot Vamp before he does something drastic, but it's too late. Emma has already been stabbed. Snake takes her to Shell 1, and when we arrive, she's already bleeding heavily. They've installed the virus, but it isn't working. It's been stopped at 90%. The virus must have been altered at some point. We now have to take drastic measures, last-ditch plans. We either destroy Arsenal Gear or take out Solidus. Emma then tells Otacon with her dying breath that she wanted to be like him. That's why she got into weapons development. She passes away, blood staining Otacon's shirt and her older brother holding her. And then Otacon drops an absolute bomb that makes everything a lot muddier. With Emma already dead, he lays it out all in the open. When Emma drowned, Otacon was actually having an affair with her mother. His father had found out about this and decided to take his own life. Feeling responsible for Emma's drowning as well had just piled on the shame and guilt that he felt. He couldn't deal with any of it, and this was why he left. Now he's lost Emma again in all of this. The cruel universe decided to give her back for one more moment, to give Otacon some form of peace, before cruelly taking it away once again. And the cherry on top of it all is that Emma's parrot is still saying his name, Hal.
Hal!
E.E.? Damn!
Otacon.
Emma clearly hadn't forgotten about him. She was thinking about him every day. Otacon then remembers Sniper Wolf, thinking that he always has to be the survivor. Snake realizes that Otacon can't continue on with them. He needs to go. He sends him off to take care of the hostages, and they do a sick-ass bro handshake. Snake then reveals that he's been working with Mr. X, and the ninja has been Olga this entire time. Raiden is then knocked out, and at this point, we really have no idea who is on our side and who isn't. The big shell then falls into the water as Otacon escapes with the hostages. Raiden awakens in the captivity of Solidus. Solidus taught Jack everything he knows. In the 80s, Raiden was actually a child soldier. He was so good that he became the leader of a unit and was given the nicknames White Devil and Jack the Ripper. Solidus then found him and named him Jack. After the war ended, he disappeared. Solidus decides to use Raiden to further his final goals. Apparently, the three are actually inside of Arsenal Gear. Ocelot takes the virus from Raiden. It didn't work because GW is still working as planned. After they leave, Olga arrives. She tells us her true intentions all along. She wasn't leading the Russian troops, that was just a distraction. She's been working for the Patriots against her will. After the tanker incident, she started working with the Russian mafia, but they were working with the Patriots, and the group took her child as soon as it was born. She never even got to see it. They will kill her kid if she doesn't do what they say. She's now working with Snake as well because she knows he didn't kill her father. Olga's job is now to assist Raiden because the Patriots can't let Solidus get away with Arsenal Gear. They're all pawns for something called the S3 plan. Destroying Arsenal Gear is a fool's errand. The only way to win this thing is to stop Solidus. Raiden is then freed and able to escape. We have to meet up with Snake so he can give us our stuff, but we have a crazy sequence where Raiden is just straight up naked, barely covering himself with his hands. This is clearly to make the player feel powerless and to make Raiden seem powerless. We have literally nothing, not even the clothes on our back. No weapons, no ways to defend ourselves or assist in stealth, just our brains. Something they can never touch, right? Raiden gets to have his resolution with Rose. He now realizes why he was so distant this whole time. His memories from his childhood have begun to flood back to him. He was trained as a child soldier. They used image training with Hollywood movies to turn him into a killer. They even put gunpowder into their food to make them more controllable. And then the Colonel calls, and things start to get really weird.
My role? Why do you keep saying that?
Why not? This is a type of role-playing game. The point is that you play out your part, and I expect you to turn in a perfect performance.
The Colonel is saying things that don't really make sense. He keeps spamming codec calls, and he almost sounds like he's malfunctioning or something.
Turn the game console off right now.
What did you say?
The mission is a failure. Cut the power right now.
What's wrong with you?
Don't worry, it's a game. It's a game just like usual.
You'll ruin your eyes playing so close to the TV.
What are you talking about?
Now, I know that I just gave you a ton of story information, and that's because MGS2 is kind of backloaded. A lot happens, and a ton is revealed in the finale of MGS2. So honestly, a lot of my analysis has to wait for the end. But one of the biggest points that I want to hammer home with this video is the concept of horror in MGS2. I actually toyed with talking about this in the video for Metal Gear Solid, but it feels like it fits perfectly into this game. I think that Metal Gear Solid has an inherent horror to it. It's a tone, an atmosphere, and a style. Now, of course, I don't mean that zombies are jumping out at us or that terrifying monsters are transforming around the corner. It's more of a subtle, permeating thing. The entire concept of stealth has a bit of horror ingrained into its veins. A lot of horror games over the years have even employed stealth as a mechanic because the two just fit so well. Horror and stealth as genres are just fated to be intertwined. This is because it is sort of terrifying to sneak, to feel that you're about to get caught, to slowly move through an area while an enemy pursues you. It's a different type of fear, a different type of horror, but it's certainly there. When you're trying to evade a group of enemies or hide from a few that are chasing you or just not get seen by the cameras, there's a little something in the back of your head that's saying, don't get caught. Metal Gear Solid pushes this even further with its sound design. The alert sound is a punishment for being found, a shrill upward noise that almost feels like scratching a record. It makes you jump when you realize you've been spotted. The intense music that follows increases that anxiety, the fear of the chase. These emotions are inherent within stealth. Stealth increases the feeling of the horror genre, the fear, and horror increases the feeling of the stealth genre. It goes both ways. So towards the end of Metal Gear Solid 2's runtime, when it takes a turn and it starts to feel more like a horror movie than an action movie, when the Colonel is throwing gibberish lines in a distorted voice through your codec, it just fits. It's like a glove for the series, but this really sets the tone for the finale. The things we're about to find out aren't just jokes. They aren't just hokey. They're kind of serious. They're terrifying, and we can trust no one. The Colonel also once again breaks the fourth wall, telling us to turn off the console, aware of the fact that we're playing a video game. Rose then speaks to us and she drops a bomb on Raiden. He was a target from the beginning. She was sent to watch him by the Patriots. She constructed a personality and a look that would suit him. She says that she really did fall in love with him. Her voice then becomes distorted as she tells Jack that she's pregnant with his child.
I'm carrying. I'm pregnant, Jack.
Rose, what's going on?
Who is there left to trust at this point? The Colonel is doing something. Our guiding source of information seems to be corrupted, and Rose was an agent of someone else all along. There's only one person Raiden can trust in all of this. He's a legend more than a man, and he's just brought our stuff back to us. Snake tells Raiden that he was using him as bait to be able to get into Arsenal gear. The giant structure is now headed toward Manhattan. There's 25 Metal Gear Rays working with it, and there's no signs that the virus they installed is working. Snake then gives us Olga's sword. She wanted Raiden to have it. This is a new weapon that we obtain only near the end of the game. We control it by using the thumbstick. Up and down does upward and downward slashes, right and left does horizontal slashes, and circling the thumbstick allows us to do a large circular move. Snake doesn't need any ammo because he has the bandana, which gives him infinite ammo, a callback to getting the Merrill ending in MGS, which gives you the bandana item, providing the player with infinite ammo. At this point, we have to push forward and fight waves and waves of soldiers, outfitted with completely different gear. They are actually called Tengu soldiers, but fighting alongside Snake would have you thinking they're incredibly weak because he wipes the floor with them. Raiden starts to talk to Snake about what's real and what's fake. He's having a hard time telling the difference, mainly because of the things that the Colonel started saying. Snake thinks it's because of the VR training that he went through, but he has a bigger piece of advice to impart onto Raiden.
Legends don't mean a whole lot. I was just a name to exploit, just like you.
People will remember only the good part, the right part of what you did.
There's no right part in murder. Not ever. And we're not in this to make a name for ourselves.
Then what are you and Otacon fighting for?
A future?
Snake then tells Raiden that if he wants to fix this whole thing, he needs to find something to believe in and find it for himself, to pass it on. Raiden, of course, then asks this question.
Believe in what?
He clearly doesn't even know where to begin. He's so incredibly green compared to Snake. Otacon then calls in and tells Raiden that he found out where the Colonel is broadcasting from, and it's directly inside of Arsenal. The Colonel actually was not Campbell all along. He was a creation of GW, an assembly of expectations and ideas that Raiden had of the Colonel. Technically, it was an artificial intelligence used to manipulate him. The virus inside of GW is messing this AI up now, causing it to malfunction. This is furthered when the Colonel calls to tell Raiden that Rose was taken hostage, but it's clearly a trap. The game even tries to convince us that we've gotten game overs, that we haven't. It's not just an AI, it's the game manipulating us. We'll get back to that idea shortly. Before we enter the true endgame, Fortune arrives. She wants revenge for the death of her father, Commander Dolph, and she still thinks Snake was responsible. Snake decides to stay back and deal with her while Raiden continues on. Raiden pops out of the hatch on top of Arsenal gear. Solidus is speaking to him. Ocelot found data on the S3 plan inside of GW. It details a plan to reproduce Solid Snake. Raiden was created by VR simulations to be another Solid Snake. Solidus used Raiden as bait for the Patriots to bring them out. He plans to kill Jack now that he's done with him by sicking an army of Rays on him. We now have to fight this army in probably one of my favorite boss fights in the Metal Gear series. We have to kill 5 of these things in total, and it can be kind of a pain. The Rays will stand on the edge of the arena for the most part, while one will jump in to fight Raiden directly. Our goal is to shoot their legs with the stinger, which opens their mouth. We can then shoot the mouth, which does more damage. But the Rays on the outside of the arena will launch missiles at us, and the one in the middle will shoot bullets and lasers at Raiden. It's a lot to manage all at once, and the best thing it does is put forth the strategy of picking the perfect moment to attack. When there's a ton of firepower being launched your way, you have to keep moving, but to attack, you have to stop. The time you pick to do this is up to you, but there are only small little windows where this is possible. The whole fight is just so epic as well. There's a horde of Rays coming at us and they don't stop. In the past, we've only faced 1 Metal Gear at a time, and now we're facing 3 at a time, taking down 5 in total. It does a great job at upping the stakes overall. Even after we defeat a certain amount of these Rays, Raiden is still defeated. He can't stand fully against the oncoming horde of Metal Gears. The tide is just too heavy. Olga ends up stepping in to save him, but she saved him only for her child. If Raiden dies, so does her kid, so she begs him to live. Solidus kills her, and she now has to trust in Raiden that he will stay alive. Suddenly, the Rays turn on Solidus. It seems the virus has actually begun to work. Solidus makes quick work of them, though. Solidus decides to spare Raiden, and Fortune enters with Snake captured. Raiden passes out and wakes up to find that GW has been fully corrupted by the virus. Fortune wants to take the Arsenal gear for herself. Solidus plans to give it to her because he never truly wanted it. Arsenal gear is far too difficult to protect. What he really wanted was the names of the Patriots. Since they control all of the information, the stuff that's been deleted and filtered out must be inside. Even though GW is corrupted, Solidus maintains that there must be a way to find out who is behind the Patriots. Ocelot then arrives, claiming that everything so far has been going to plan. This is because Ocelot has gone rogue. He's working with the Patriots. The S3 plan was meant to make soldiers like Snake, and this entire thing so far has been meant to train Raiden. The entire Big Shell was just a recreation of Shadow Moses. Everything that we've seen so far has been planned. Aim's pacemaker was shut down on purpose. Olga was sent here by the Patriots. Fat Man was the only thing that wasn't like Shadow Moses. He was meant to be a test for Raiden to see if he could continue on. Dead Cell, Olga, even Solidus, they were all used to create the perfect training simulation, the perfect soldier.
Given the right situation, the right story, anyone can be shaped into Snake. Even rookies can fight like men of experience.
Solidus himself was selected because their relationship resembles Big Boss and Snake. Everything was planned even before the tanker incident. Solidus was purposefully pitted against the Patriots. His anger and hatred were used and planned. The only thing that wasn't planned so far was Snake's involvement. Even fortune was used. Ocelot proves this as he shoots her and the bullet hits. She never really had luck. She was wearing electromagnetic weapons technology provided by the Patriots. This is what caused bullets to avoid her. Ocelot now has the same gear and no one can hit him. Ocelot then rains down missiles and Fortune somehow actually uses luck to deflect them, bringing into question whether it was actually real or not. Fortune then dies and the Liquid arm takes over Ocelot. All three brothers have been reunited as Liquid is in full control. Liquid then reveals that he was behind the leak that brought Snake and Otacon to the tanker. He wants to take down the Patriots, but before he does that, he aims to be the sole remaining genetic clone of Big Boss. To that end, he wants to take out his brothers. Snake manages to get out of his cuffs and he jumps off Arsenal, diving after Liquid. Arsenal then begins to plow its way through Manhattan, and Raiden and Solidus are on top of Federal Hall, ready to set up the final confrontation, the final battle of this story. Okay, I just spilled a lot of information all at once, so let's backtrack. The biggest reveal that we just got was basically that everything was planned. Ocelot had been working with the Patriots and they had organized everything from the get-go. This entire thing, the whole mission that we've been working on so far, has just been a training exercise. Now, I just want to make it clear that this doesn't mean it was a simulation. All of this actually happened, but it was orchestrated to recreate the events of Shadow Moses, to create a new version of Solid Snake, one that could be controlled, unlike Snake himself. Now, this explains a lot. First of all, it explains exactly why Raiden is the way he is, and honestly, we haven't really talked about Raiden too much at all in this video. This is because a lot of his character and even his reason for existing doesn't really make sense until this moment. The reason that we play Raiden in this entry and not Snake is because we're being used. In Metal Gear Solid, Snake was a pawn. He was used by Foxhound to inadvertently launch Metal Gear. He was even used and thrown away by the US government. Raiden finds himself in a similar place in Metal Gear Solid 2, though it's much more overt. He's controlled by the Patriots into doing exactly what they want. They plan to use him as a new super soldier. Now, this also isn't exactly true. We'll get into another piece of information here shortly that will actually take this even further, but the reason doesn't really matter. All that matters here is that Raiden was used. This explains why Raiden is made to be this naive, kind of whiny character. He's not Snake. He's meant to be the exact contrast of Snake, to show that even the most green of soldiers can be melded into a legend like Solid Snake. But how did the Patriots do this? Well, they recreated Metal Gear Solid 1. This is why we see so many shocking similarities to the first game in the plant chapter. Looking back, Raiden enters the plant through the water, just like Snake did in the first game. Raiden waits for the elevator to arrive, just like Snake. Raiden is even warned about the mines as he approaches the bridge by a mysterious figure who then turns out to be a cyborg ninja. That same ninja saves him later and tries to slice off Ocelot's arm. Both hostages that we interact with in the game end up dying, one of them a president. We're even taken hostage and forced to endure a torture sequence. There are many other similarities, but perhaps the most important is the relationship between Solidus and Raiden. Solidus is revealed to be Jack's father, sort of. He took him in and trained him. He made him what he is, effectively passing down his knowledge to the next generation. This is pretty similar to Big Boss passing his genes onto Solid Snake. This isn't the same as Shadow Moses, it's more like when Snake fights Big Boss in Metal Gear 2, but the relationship is still there. Father and son forced to fight not only because of a mission, but because they disagree fundamentally. And when Snake heads to Zanzibar, why does he go? Because he's having nightmares. Because he can't leave the battlefield behind. It haunts him. Raiden's child soldier memories haunt him as well. They prevent him from having a successful relationship with Rose. Snake and Raiden are similar, but Snake and Raiden are also very different. The two handle things in almost the exact opposite way. When Snake is told that he's a pawn in Metal Gear Solid, he doesn't lash out. Sure, he's surprised, who wouldn't be, but he doesn't get angry. He finds a solution to the problem and decides to try and fix it. Raiden is constantly in need of control. He needs to be pushed in the right direction, otherwise he'll break down. He constantly asks himself and the Colonel throughout the game whether this is a dream or a simulation. He questions his reality. He never truly knows what's going on, and he gets angry when he doesn't get the answers that he wants. Snake tries to teach him this lesson as they invade Arsenal Gear because he can tell that Raiden is not living for himself. He's living for others. He's created a persona that is based on simulations and ideas of individuals rather than finding why he wants to live his own life. He tells Raiden that he has to find his own reason to fight, for himself, rather than someone telling him what his reason is, and Raiden still doesn't get this.
Find something to believe in, and find it for yourself. And when you do, pass it on to the future.
Believe in what?
That's your problem.
This is essential in trying to understand what Snake is saying here. No one can tell Raiden what to believe in. He needs to figure it out on his own. Raiden has already had everyone around him telling him what to believe in. The Colonel and Rose have been manipulating him from the beginning, telling him where to go and what to do and when to do it and how to do it. The only way to break this, to live free, is to find out what he believes in for himself. Raiden was created by VR simulations. His capabilities as a soldier come from VR training. This is talked about quite a lot throughout the game, especially when Raiden is talking to Snake. He constantly questions the effectiveness of this training and whether it actually works compared to in-field experience. This leads me to my final point about the whole training exercise reveal. The things that Raiden has gone through are similar to what Snake has gone through, but Snake and Raiden are not similar. And this is the point that the game is trying to make, because Raiden is not Snake. He is the player. He is you. He is me. He is all of us. The VR training that Raiden has gone through is very similar to playing Metal Gear Solid 1, or literally doing VR missions in Metal Gear Solid 1. As the player, we have gone through that with Raiden. We have played through the Shadow Moses simulation. We have trained in VR missions. In our mind, we're experienced, but are we really? Just because we have played Metal Gear Solid 1 doesn't mean that we are Snake. We are still ourselves. We're still normal people. We're not action heroes. This is why Raiden is a bit more naive. Raiden has real problems, unlike Snake. He reacts poorly to the idea that he is being used. He doesn't keep his cool or his calm in the face of grave danger. He is easily cracked. He has a girlfriend who he has real problems with. She calls him to go over their relationship issues with him being closed off, keeping her at a distance. These are complex, real issues. Snake doesn't have these issues. He's a genetic clone of a legendary soldier. He was designed from birth to keep calm in the face of danger, to brush things off, to keep people away from him so he doesn't have these relationship problems affecting the mission. But why is Raiden pitted as the player in this game? Why would the team want us to feel further from Snake? Well, first of all, this builds up Snake as an even more legendary figure. When we are put in the shoes of someone that isn't really like him, it makes us realize how truly good he is. Kojima even specifically references the scene on Arsenal Gear when Snake gets out of his handcuffs quickly, but Raiden doesn't. This shows the valley between real experience and VR. Basically, Kojima is telling us to touch grass. In all seriousness, though, the game points towards this idea of video games as war simulations, programming a generation of soldiers that think they're soldiers, or rather the idea of video games creating a generation of people that think they've done things when they haven't. Raiden specifically takes his ideals from others, and maybe this isn't an argument about violent video games being bad, but rather creating your own worldview, your own reasons for living. Not just seeing it work for someone else and taking it for yourself, carving your path, cutting through the forest to find something new, but doing it for yourself, not because someone told you to. This part is surely important, and this reveal tells us a lot about the game and why certain choices were made. I don't really see how you could get to this point of the story and not understand why Raiden was designed the way he was, but this isn't nearly the end. Perhaps the most important sequence that Metal Gear Solid 2 would give us is just ahead. Snake has gone off to fight Liquid to chase him down, and Raiden has landed on the roof of Federal Hall in Manhattan. I should note here that the scene of Arsenal crashing into the city was originally supposed to be much more detailed, but a lot of it was cut when, a few months before the release of the game, the September 11th attacks happened in New York City. At this point, Kojima was even questioning whether he should release the game at all, but eventually he was convinced by his superiors to continue with his original intentions. They just had to cut some scenes. It's just Raiden and Solidus now. Solidus asks Raiden the date. Turns out, it's April 30th, the day that Rose wanted Raiden to remember. It happens to be the inauguration date of George Washington, the first president of the United States of America. This was part of Solidus's plan, to take over and liberate the city on the same day. He wanted freedom, not power, but to rid the country of the Patriots' rule.
Jack, listen to me. We're all born with an expiration date. No one lasts forever. Life is nothing but a grace period for turning the best of our genetic material into the next generation.
Solidus can't actually reproduce. None of the clones can. They were designed this way. But your genes aren't the only thing that you can pass on. Solidus wants to be remembered. He wants a legacy. He wants to go down in history. But this is almost impossible now. People can't determine whether they're remembered or not. The Patriots will just control that information. Then the Colonel calls us. This is the codec conversation that changes the entire game. It's the most iconic part of the game and probably what everyone knows this game for now. Of course, this isn't actually the Colonel, and it doesn't really make sense that this AI that's taken the Colonel's face is calling because GW has been infected with a virus. The AI explains that they are formless, more of a consciousness than an AI, and as long as a nation exists, they will too. They claim to have people's interest in mind, not themselves. Early in the century, they had managed to fully map the human genome, but memories, ideas, and culture were not covered by this genome. They argue that these things should be passed on as well, and across history, these things were passed on. A small selection of written or spoken information was chosen to be passed on to the future generations. This isn't true anymore, though. With the digital age, everything is preserved, everything is kept, nothing goes away. Most of this data is junk, and it's growing incredibly fast. And they don't necessarily think of what they're doing as censorship, they specifically want to create context. They then criticize modern society a lot.
Everyone withdraws into their own small gated community, afraid of a larger forum. They stay inside their little ponds, leaking whatever truth suits them into the growing cesspool of society at large.
Raiden says that he will decide what to believe in and what to pass on, but the AI says that even this idea came from Snake, not from himself. They then use this to point out the flaws in humanity and how they are not competent enough to create the context that the world needs. They then reveal that Ocelot wasn't even told the whole truth. The S3 plan actually stood for Selection for Societal Sanity. S3 is really a system to control public will and consciousness, but this wasn't meant to control Raiden and make a soldier. It was designed because the system needed a final test, more data to get it ready. Now, GW is truly complete. Now, I'd like to dissect and analyze this conversation pretty heavily, because this conversation has sort of outlived Metal Gear Solid 2 as a whole. It's been touted online as one of the most prophetic things ever put into a video game, effectively predicting the future, and in a lot of ways it reminds me of the way people see the original Deus Ex today. I want to go through this conversation with a fine-tooth comb and determine if it really did predict the modern state that we live in today. And if it did, how accurate really was it? So Raiden is effectively talking to the Patriots here, sort of, or at least their AI mouthpiece that speaks for them, but the AI at least has the same motives as the Patriots. The AI first explains that they were a layer of consciousness that formed in the crucible of the White House, relating this to a primordial soup, the way life was originally formed on our planet. This is something that's more in reference to the game itself and its world, but the AI also says that they are the discipline and morality that Americans invoke so often. So effectively, they are a concept more than anything. Patriotism as a concept or an ideal given voice. This is why they can't be eliminated, because they are chained to American ideals. This line sort of invokes a parasitic relationship between the two, this consciousness and the nation itself, or the concept of the nation.
We are formless. We are the very discipline and morality that Americans invoke so often. How can anyone hope to eliminate us? As long as this nation exists, so will we.
Raiden is, of course, just mad that they are censoring the internet. Our villains here explain that they have the interests of the people in mind. It's not a selfish endeavor. This is something that all good villains have, realistic motives. They aren't mustache-twirling men in suits. They think that they're doing good for the world. They then explain the idea of passing on culture, history, human memories.
But in the current digitized world, trivial information is accumulating every second, preserved in all its triteness, never fading, always accessible.
Rumors about petty issues, misinterpretations, slander.
All of this junk data, preserved in an unfiltered state, growing at an alarming rate.
It will only slow down social progress, reduce the rate of evolution.
This is the first truth, so to speak. This game was made in 2001. The internet was made accessible in the early 90s to the public, so by this time, people had been using it quite a bit. But now, in the year 2024, we have about 30 years of public internet access in our history, and with every year, the ability to accumulate information has only increased. Everything is archived now. Everything is kept. Someone is out there preserving it all somewhere. It's all documented. There are many examples of this accumulation of information. I mean, look at the website that you're on right now, YouTube. Somewhere around 3.7 million videos are uploaded to YouTube per day on average. If you take the average video length of 4.4 minutes, you get 271,000 hours of new content uploaded every day. That's 11,000 hours every hour, 188 hours every minute. That is a literal flood compared to the actual passage of time. You will never see all of this content or even understand the size of it. I mean, right now you're watching a multiple-hour video essay about a video game. Don't think that I'm unaware of my own position in this, that I myself as a content creator contribute to the creation and amassing of this flood of information, this junk data. I'm not so high on myself to think that I create something so powerful that it deserves to be put above the flood. But now it's not just YouTube. TikTok has about half of the users of YouTube, but it boasts a staggering 34 million videos uploaded every day, amassing even more content than YouTube very quickly. And this content is much shorter on average and consumed much quicker. Scrolling and flipping through these videos leaves us to wonder, are we really even taking that content in? Are we even really consuming it? Or is it just there? It surely does something to us subconsciously, but will we ever remember it? Will it ever leave any kind of legacy? Or is it just junk data? Will you remember this video in a week, a month, a year? Or will it just sit there? My role in this, I guess, is to try and create things that people will remember. But is that just man's hubris, his folly, to assume that he can overcome the flood? So, that one's true. Let's move on to the next statement. The AI then goes on to give examples of this information, rumors about petty issues, misinterpretations, slander. And this is all true as well. I won't go in as hard on this statement because it's an expansion of the last one, but even social media is an example of this. People squabbling on Facebook, Twitter threads of drama about your favorite online figure, Instagram fights in the comments. It's all there. It's rarely ever just getting thrown away. It will all be preserved, but does it need to be? That's the question. The AI argues that this will slow down social progress and reduce the rate of evolution. This is something that's a little bit harder to quantify. It's difficult to tell whether we as a species can evolve faster or slower due to information access. This is because evolution is such a broad term. It's so vague that it can be kind of hard to determine exactly what they're talking about. I mean, we can definitely say that people aren't physically evolving or mentally evolving, but the AI also states that social progress will be slowed as well by an accumulation of information. This is one that I think is still hard to quantify, but I can at least speak from my perspective. It doesn't seem like we've made more social progress in the last 20 years or so, but less. People seem to be more divided than ever in modern society, and a lot of this seems like it comes from the internet. More access to information has made people terminally online, constantly fighting and bickering with people they don't agree with. So this one I'm willing to put in the sort of true column. It certainly feels true, and I think a lot of the statements made here nail the feeling of what it's like to live in the modern era, which might be more important in this context than even being accurate. The AI then continues on to say that they don't mean to censor content outright, but to create context for that content. They claim that the digital society furthers human flaws and rewards half-truths. They then give examples of juxtapositions of morality, 3 in total. Their final example is that society tells people to be nice, but to also win and get ahead, yet it's obvious that only a few will succeed. They then say that this is all rhetoric to avoid conflict, and perhaps my favorite and the most prophetic line in this entire speech:
everyone withdraws into their own small gated community, afraid of a larger forum. They stay inside their little ponds, leaking whatever truth suits them into the growing cesspool of society at large.
The different cardinal truths neither clash nor mesh. No one is invalidated, but nobody is right.
This is easily the most true of all the statements made here. In my mind, this perfectly emulates the modern state of the internet and society at large. It basically predicts the rise of social media and content algorithms. The internet is in a state where it chooses what you see. It predicts what you want to see. It knows you almost better than you know yourself. This prediction leads people into echo chambers, little ponds that they can stay in, never really being challenged. And when they do manage to leave those ponds, maybe because something slips through or a piece of media hits the modern zeitgeist at large, it is a shock to their system. Doesn't everyone agree with me? Doesn't everyone feel this way? The more dialed in these algorithms become, the more we will eventually just conform to them. Everyone has had the experience of thinking about or saying something and seeing an ad for it on your phone later. This statement by the AI just clearly represents this, in my opinion.
And this is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper.
The AI says that they are trying to stop this, that it's their responsibility. They're doing it for the greater good. Once again, Raiden says that he will decide what to pass on, but the AI points out that this is untrue, that he got this from Snake. This questions his ability to even have free will, the will to choose, the will to decide. They claim that Raiden or humanity in general is not capable of choosing what to pass on, that the self is a concept that doesn't even exist. This is probably the most terrifying part of the conversation. This forces the player to ask themselves how many of my ideas are original. And I think this is a fear that a lot of people have, that their personalities are just amalgamations of other things, seen in media, seen online, that there is really nothing new under the sun. But to entertain that idea, to face it head on, is sort of horrific.
Is that even your own idea?
Or something Snake told you?
That's the proof of your incompetence right there. You lack the qualifications to exercise free will.
That's not true. I have the right.
Does something like a self exist inside of you?
That which you call self serves as nothing more than a mask to cover your own being.
They then show Jack exactly how he was manipulated by Rose. They show Raiden exactly how he falters, how he blames other things instead of himself. They then claim that someone like him shouldn't even have the right to decide. They claim that the individual is supposed to be weak, but far from powerless, and that a single person has the ability to rule the world. The individual has become too strong in the digital age. The AI then moves on to saying that their ultimate goal is not information control, but controlling humans through behaviors. They explain the S3 system, how it will control consciousness. Raiden was proof of this. They created circumstances to create him, to make him what he is now. They are playing God, effectively. The last big statement that's made isn't really one single statement. It's sort of a general idea that humanity is a byproduct of everything that they experience, that circumstances create us, and that if those circumstances can be replicated, then the Patriots or the AI or whatever can mold and change humanity however they like. that they can create a world, or have already created a world, where free will doesn't really exist, but the manipulated think that it exists. A lot of this speech can be deceptively true, and I think to fully analyze it, we actually need the second part, which is the end of the game. So let's continue on briefly before we return. After this conversation, Raiden is face to face with Solidus. This is the final part of the test. Raiden must overcome his father. He must fight Solidus and kill him. The two are pitted against each other like gladiators in a coliseum. The AI even refers to them as monsters.
We will collect the necessary data from this last fight. Then we'll consider the exercise closed. So, Jack the Ripper, will it be Solidus, the Patriot's creation, or you, Solidus's creation? Our beloved monsters, enjoy yourselves.
It almost feels like forcing ants in a bucket to fight. Solidus must win because the data on the Patriots is inside of Raiden in his nanomachines, and Raiden must win because Olga's child will die if he doesn't, and so will Rose. Raiden also gets extra motivation because Solidus reveals that he killed Raiden's parents. He was playing God as well, trying to see if humanity was really someone else's creation. Raiden tries to claim one more time that he wasn't a pawn, but the AI squashes this idea pretty quickly. Raiden and all the Metal Gears thus far have been named after Japanese warplanes. They're just weapons, just guns being fired in a battle. It all seems so hopeless. We then fight Solidus on top of Federal Hall, our only weapon, the sword that Olga gave us. This battle can be kind of tough because Solidus is a strong opponent. We can block most of his attacks and get into a rhythm, finding small openings where they exist. I want to once again point out that this battle fits really well with the one-on-one finale trope that Metal Gear has set up in its series. This time, though, we're no longer fighting fist to fist, but it is melee combat for the most part. It fits in line with the theme that this game carries as well, upping the ante wherever possible. It is kind of hard to appreciate this battle, though, especially after the information that we just heard. What is even the point? Who are we fighting for? What are we fighting for? If we kill Solidus, we save someone, but we let the Patriots win. We still lose in the end. Once we defeat Solidus, he falls and dies poetically at the statue of George Washington. His plans to take down the Patriots have been foiled. Then outside, we get our final sequence of the game. Raiden meets with Snake. He gives him some very good advice, and for me, this final scene actually really heavily affects how you view the previous codec conversation.
The memories you have and the role you were assigned are burdens you had to carry. It doesn't matter if they were real or not. That's never the point.
Snake is telling Raiden here that the whole idea of free will and whether things have been orchestrated behind the scenes doesn't really matter.
Then, what am I supposed to believe in? What am I going to leave behind when I'm through?
We can tell other people about having faith. What we had faith in. What we found important enough to fight for. It's not whether you were right or wrong, but how much faith you were willing to have. That decides the future.
He effectively gives Raiden back his free will. He tells him to choose for himself, to get a new name, have new memories, start with a clean slate. And this is what Raiden does. He casts aside the dog tags that we gave him at the beginning of the game. He separates himself from the player. He doesn't have our name anymore. His name is his own. His destiny is his own. He's determined to find something worth passing on, and he chooses to realize the good things that they taught him as well. Snake has put a tracker on Liquid's Ray. He thinks Liquid is going after the Patriots. Snake has the disk with the list of names of the Patriots. It's actually the virus that was designed to delete the records of their names from GW. Since it had to have the parameters specifying what to delete, it should have their names on there. Snake then leaves and Rose arrives. The two decide to become their own people. April 30th was also the day they met, something that Rose had been trying to get Jack to realize. Snake then gives one final speech about passing things on, passing on culture, books, movies. He says that we as humans have a right to pass on what we can. After the credits, we hear Otacon and Snake talking. They have the names of the Patriots, but every single one of them has been dead for 100 years. This sets up the next entry in the series. Now, I want to go back to this final selection of scenes, specifically the one with Raiden and Snake. There's a lot of ways to view this scene. In particular, I think there are 3. The first is the way that Kojima says that he meant it. In this interpretation, this is Kojima speaking to his team. Kojima is Snake, and his team of developers are Raiden. After MGS2, he actually planned to leave the Metal Gear series, and he was talking to the ones he was leaving behind here. He was effectively telling them the keys to making another Metal Gear game, and making it with the same spirit that he intended to. But also, I like to view this as Kojima talking directly to the player, which I think is the second way to look at this scene. Kojima is imparting his themes onto us directly. The theme of Metal Gear Solid 2 is clearly about what you pass on, or memes, as Kojima likes to say. It's about the importance of passing on things to the next generation, whether that's Kojima to his team, his real-life son, or us, the players.
I know you didn't have much in terms of choices this time, but everything you felt, thought about during this mission is yours, and what you decide to do with them is your choice.
You mean start over?
Yeah, a clean slate, a new name, new memories.
Kojima is trying to give us agency over ourselves and to teach us something while playing a video game, which was one of his goals that he's always stated that he has when making games. But the third way that I viewed this scene was a bit more personal. Making this video was kind of difficult for me. I wanted to focus on the codec call with the AI quite a bit because I think it is important, and other people think it's important, so it became a focal point. I watched it quite a lot and thought a lot about the modern world. I'm not exactly a historically negative person, but it kind of put me in a doomer pit for a little bit. But I neglected to focus on this last scene, where Kojima himself basically pulls the player out of that same pit that he may have just put them in on purpose. Thinking a lot about the problems of the modern world can lead you down a certain path. Maybe the Patriots are right. Maybe we are being controlled. Maybe we have no will, no capability to decide what is right moving forward. Maybe information is being controlled. Maybe we are silenced effectively because we have too much power as the individual, or maybe we are at the mercy of the flood, liable to get lost in the swarm of junk data and information. But then I realized we're not supposed to side with the Patriots. Looking at that codec call and being like, wow, everything they said is right, just completely ignores the rest of this ending. It falls into the Patriots' trap. They haven't only manipulated Raiden, they've manipulated the player into believing their lies. No, none of that is true. None of what they say is true. What does Snake say right after that call?
They taught me some good things, too.
I know. We've inherited freedom from all those who fought for it. We all have the freedom to spread the word.
We have inherited freedom. The world may be dark sometimes, and it may get in the way of things that you want to do or feel like are possible, but we have the free will to choose, to view things the way we want to. The things we feel are real, the memories we have are real, and at the end of the day, we choose what to pass on. This scene to me feels like Snake effectively saying to worry about the self. Focus on what to pass on to those around you, and maybe don't get lost in the grand cataclysm of it all. It's uplifting, it's neutralizing, it's freedom. It's a cautionary tale for the modern age. This wasn't meant to look back on and say, wow, things have gotten so bad. It's a possible scenario to show what could happen if you let others decide what to pass on for you. I think we can all learn something from this game. It's saying a lot of things all at once, a lot of incredible things, a lot of terrifying things, and a lot of uplifting things. But I think getting lost in the nihilism of it and the predictions is kind of seeing the forest for the trees. Once you take a look at the overall picture, the future looks a little more bright. But hey, maybe that's just me being naively optimistic. Metal Gear Solid 2 is a revolutionary piece of media. It's a story about destiny, revenge, corruption, control, free will, freedom, patriotism, nations, information. It's a piece of media that will genuinely be remembered for a very long time. And it's not just remembered because of its legacy. It's not just because it's included in the Metal Gear series. It's because of what the game says, the issues that it deals with, and the way that it presents them. It's both subversive and satisfying at the same time. The way that the game plays with your emotions is almost terrifying. The fact that a video game can have such a deep control over its player is fascinating. And it's a game that clearly stands the test of time, because people are still talking about it today. The gameplay should not be understated though, because Metal Gear Solid 2 once again brings Metal Gear into a new era, upgraded gameplay in almost every way, while also keeping the core of the series' mechanics and style. We didn't talk about it much because it wasn't as much of a focus as it was in Metal Gear Solid, but the cool is still there as well. These grand scenes on top of Arsenal gear, fighting a Harrier jet on a bridge, a tanker crashing in a bay, a horde of Metal Gears. The cinematic style that Kojima wanted to go for in the beginning is still there. That's one of the strengths of Metal Gear as a series, is bringing in new ideas without getting rid of what worked already. Metal Gear Solid 2 doesn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It just expands on the things that make the series what it is. At the end of the day, that's being both incredibly cool and having something to say about the world. Metal Gear Solid 2 does all of this very well, with great performances, fantastic sound and level design, a wonderful world, a terrifying message, and great characters. Metal Gear Solid 2 is a mystery, one that you might not even want to solve, but at the end of the day, it has an effect on those who play it, and that's what Kojima was going for. The game was an incredible success in both Japan and the US. Critically, it was beloved, praised for its themes, its groundbreaking story, and its challenging narrative. Fans, of course, had some issues, and the choices that were made in story were quite controversial for the time, but the game sold incredibly well. It topped sales charts in the US, Japan, and Europe, and by 2003, the game had sold over 7 million units, easily surpassing Metal Gear Solid. And of course, this would not be the end for the series. Even though Kojima planned to leave after the second entry, he would once again feel the pull to return to Metal Gear, to make yet another game in this grand saga. But we'll talk about that next time. Bye, Dad.